Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Peter takes Tony's help to control his overwhelming power. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Peter blinked up at Captain Marvel as she landed in front of him. He was hugging the gauntlet to his chest, protecting it with his body as if that could help. He was so far out of his depth that he felt like he was drowning, but he was pretty sure he wasn't the only one. Everyone here, even the Avengers, were just as lost as him, he thought. This was the craziest thing that had ever happened to him. He looked up at her, trying to engage his mind to speak. She gave him a small smile, a sweet one, the kind Liz had given him once. "Hi, I'm Peter Parker." She smiled again, but the urgency in her eyes became more intense. "Hey, Peter Parker. You got something for me?" Peter started to push himself to his feet, on the point of handing over the gauntlet and freeing himself of the responsibility of holding it. And then he stopped. His mind flipped back to a conversation he had once on one of the most amazing and mortifying days of his life. Iron Man himself had sat in Peter's bedroom. His messy and small bedroom. "God, Peter, why don't you ever clean up?" Looking at him like he was someone that mattered. "When you can do the things that I can, but you don't. And then the bad things happen. They happen because of you." He looked at the gauntlet, feeling its weight and power as if it was thrumming through his veins, and then he felt a wave of calm that was entirely foreign to him. He didn't think of the danger he was in or what Tony would call his sheer stupidity. For the first time in his life, he knew he was doing the absolute right thing. It was like an out-of-body experience. He slid the gauntlet onto his arm, cold and heavy but also oddly right. It seemed to shrink, sealing itself against his skin as he lifted his hand. Captain Marvel reached for him, shock in her eyes, and he heard a bellow echoing to him through the chaos of the battlefield. "Don't you dare, Peter." "Sorry, Mr. Stark, I gotta," he said. He stared at his hand, the gems over his knuckles, then took a breath and snapped his fingers. There was a scream unlike anything he'd ever heard in his life. It was inhuman. Only when his head started to swim from lack of air did he realize it was him making that sound. Weird, he thought. It doesn't even hurt that. Then the pain came. He felt like he was on fire, his skin blistering, scorching, peeling away from his skin to expose nerves and muscles that then burned away until he felt nothing. He fell back and was vaguely aware of Captain Marvel being blasted away from him by a wave of colored light that spread from him like a bomb. Absolute silence fell then, broken only by a quiet voice that he'd never heard before. It was British, precise, and oddly neutral. "He is worthy." He felt his lips move in a whisper, though he had no lips anymore, they had burned away. "I'm worthy?" There was a sigh, and then he felt nothing at all. The pain was gone, sounds and sights were gone. For the first time since he had been bitten by the spider, since Spider-Man was created, he wasn't overwhelmed by everything around him. It was the greatest relief. Tony's eyes were locked on the kid as he sat on the ground, curled over the gauntlet. "Too young," his mind screamed. "He's too young to be here. What were you thinking, Stark? Look at him." He engaged his thrusters and blasted towards him, but the distance was great, and he felt like he was moving in slow motion. "Faster, Friday," he ordered. "Get me to that damn kid." "Full thrusters already engaged," she replied. "Then make them faster." Danvers landed in front of Peter, and Tony felt a twinge of relief that Peter wasn't alone now. He was probably babbling, introducing himself in that hyped-up kid on a sugar rush way he had that sometimes gave Tony a headache and other times made him smile at the pure innocence and enthusiasm of youth that hadn't yet been beaten out of him by life. Tony had never been that way. Life had kicked it out of him before he could walk. Peter started to get to his feet, his hand twitching as if to give up the burden he should never have held, and then he stopped. Tony knew the battle was still waging around them, people fighting for their lives and the world. But his attention was purely on Peter as he lifted the gauntlet and then slid it onto his arm and lifted his hand. "No," Tony thought it had been a shout, but he heard the whisper. He sucked in a breath and then bellowed, "Don't you dare, Peter." Danvers reached for Peter, and Tony thought the kid said something, but he was still too far away to hear. "Friday, faster," he urged. Peter's jaw set, and then he snapped his fingers. There was nothing for a moment, and then a scream ripped through the air. It was unlike anything Tony had ever heard. He didn't even know humans were capable of making such a sound. It held agony unlike anything he'd ever felt or seen in his life. If the kid was in that kind of pain, how was he still conscious? Surely his mind and body would shut down to protect him. Tony needed it to shut down. He couldn't bear listening to the kid making that sound, driving home the knowledge of the pain he must be in. Tony should have put something in the suit for this. Some kind of embedded super sedative, strong enough to defeat the kid's metabolism, to shut him down to protect him from this kind of pain. Why hadn't he thought of it? What was the good of the baby monitor protocol if it didn't save him from this? It tracked him, told him where Peter was and what he was doing. It warned him of the worst kinds of trouble the kid managed to get himself into, told him so he could get there and pull him out of the fire, but he couldn't get there now. He saw lights moving up Peter's arm. The colors of the stones merged into a rainbow that rose up the gauntlet across his chest to the place right over his heart. And then the shockwave came. Danvers was blasted back and then Tony, too. He was within feet of Peter when it happened, and then he was thrown so far, he lost track of where he was. He landed hard on his back with such force that he now understood how Rhodey had felt when he'd fallen dead stick from the sky. Tony was sure every bone in his body had been broken with the landing, and when he tried to move, he couldn't. But there was no pain. "Get this damn suit off," he growled, his thoughts too scattered to do it himself. It receded from him, and he scrambled to his feet then sprinted forward, breaths panting and muscles screaming with the strain. He couldn't see Peter, though. He couldn't see anything at all. His eyes were blurring and pricking, and it took him a moment to realize he was crying. "Friday, where am I going?" He shouted and then cursed as he realized he'd lost touch with the AI when he'd shed the suit. Tony wiped his eyes of the tears, clearing his vision, then corrected his stride right and sprinted. He found himself swerving through a crowd of people who had been fighting for their lives moments ago and now seemed to be shocked into stillness as the dust of their enemies floated on the air. Barely registering the dust and what it meant, Tony saw a thin line of people that were gathered around something. He shoved his way through them and then skidded to a stop at the horror he saw. Peter was lying on the ground, eyes closed and face starkly pale. His lips were slightly parted, but Tony could see no breaths moving his chest. "No," he groaned. "Please, no." His knees buckled, and he dropped, his mind swimming with shock and heart throbbing with pain. "Tony." There was a soft hand on his face, and it was turned to the side. He saw Pepper, her hair tousled and face pale. She'd shed her suit, too. "Help him," he whispered, though he knew she was no more capable of saving Peter than he was. "We can't get close," she said. Tony's eyes moved to Peter, and he saw what he had missed before. Thor and Steve were positioned as if pressing against an impenetrable glass wall 6 feet away from the prone boy. Thor swung back his axe and slammed it forward, but it bounced off the invisible barrier, and he was thrown back 12 feet, crashing through the people behind him and hitting the ground with a grunt. "Peter," Tony whispered. "Peter, please." Steve's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Again, Tony," he ordered. Tony's mind felt sluggish, and he said, "What?" in a dull voice. Steve pressed his hand up to the barrier in front of him and said, "Say something to him." "But Tony swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence that would destroy him. "Just say it," Steve snapped. Not knowing why, sure it was too late, Peter couldn't hear him. Tony started to crawl forward, legs too weak to hold him, and said, "Pete, it's me. I'm coming." Steve pressed both hands against the barrier in front of him and then stumbled forwards as it evidently disappeared. He raced forward and dropped to his knees beside Peter, pressing his fingers to the kid's pale throat and then placing his hand on his chest. When Tony reached them, a lifetime and seconds later, he fell back on his haunches beside Steve and his eyes roved over Peter's form, not his body. Please don't be just a dead body. He saw the smallest flicker of Peter's chest, the tiniest movement of too young for this fight lungs trying to work, and he began to breathe again himself. Steve leaned closer, seeming to be listening to something, and then he straightened and said, "Yeah, you are, kid. You really are." "Or what?" Tony asked. Steve didn't answer. He was still trying to rouse Peter, rubbing his knuckles into his sternum with so much force that Tony thought he might break Peter's ribs, and then he nodded and said, "That's it. Just like that." Tony's eyes widened as he saw Peter's chest moving again, rising and falling properly now, real, full breaths. Tony's breaths moved in rhythm with Peter's, flooding his brain with the oxygen that it had been crying out for and clearing his mind. Tony touched Peter's face, turning it to him, and stroked his cheek with his thumb. "That's it, kid," he said gently, "you got it." "Can you hear him?" Steve asked. Tony frowned and leaned close to Peter. He wasn't speaking, his lips weren't moving, but Tony heard the words. "Worthy, worthy." It was Peter's voice, so familiar and missed for the 5 long years, but it wasn't right. It wasn't the high-speed chatter it had been before. It was slow and steady, precise, and how could a voice hold that much wisdom in only 2 syllables and in one so young? And why did Peter's voice remind Tony of vision? How is he saying that? Tony asked. How is he not saying that? Because that's not him. Steve ignored the question and said, "We need to move him. He's breathing, but I don't like the way he's looking. He needs medical attention." Tony looked around him helplessly. He wanted Peter with the best possible equipment and people to help him, but they'd blown with the compound. "Wakanda," Steve said, then called over his shoulder, "Doctor Strange?" Strange walked forward and looked down at them, eyes falling on Peter, and he said, "Wakanda?" Steve nodded. "Fast. Look at his eyes." Strange bent and pulled back Peter's eyelids, and his twitch that broke his solemn and calm demeanor. He straightened up again and began to swirl his hands in that strange pattern that created a portal of orange light. "You want to carry him, Tony?" Steve asked. Tony reached for Peter, but his hands were shaking so much and felt disconnected from him. He didn't feel wholly in control of his body while his fear for Peter was paramount. Hating that he couldn't be the one, that he couldn't even hold the kid the way he longed to, he shook his head and said, "You'll have to do it, Steve. My hands." Steve nodded and eased his arms under Peter, pulled him up and against his chest, then got smoothly to his feet. Peter's limbs hung limp, his head lolling over Steve's arm and mouth slightly open. Tony stood and reached to move his head, to settle it against Steve's shoulder, but before he could force his slow and shaking hand to touch him, Steve was stepping away, through the portal. Tony didn't even glance back over his shoulder at Pepper, to reassure or call her to come. He just stepped through the portal, following his kid. The moment they stepped into the shining lobby of the Wakandan hospital, Steve shouted for help, clutching Peter against his chest. There was a flurry of movement around them and voices shouting in a language that Tony didn't understand. A stretcher was wheeled to them, and Steve was instructed to lay Peter down. Tony watched, seeing the hesitation in Steve's face before he obeyed, and he wondered if Steve felt any of the terror and fear he felt. With Peter being held by one of them, even though it wasn't himself, Tony felt better than he did now, handing him over to strangers. Peter was settled on the stretcher and wheeled away. Tony stood frozen behind them as the kid was moved out of his sight, and then the stretcher skidded to a halt, and the people around it were knocked back a few feet. There were shouts of shock, and then a deep-voiced male, dressed in a white doctor's scrubs, looked back to where Tony and Steve stood and asked, "What did you bring us?" "We don't know," Steve said. "He was wearing the Infinity Stone's gauntlet when he snapped. It's done something to him." "Peter," Tony said quietly, staring at the kid's pale face. "We brought you Peter." His mind snapped back into action and his panic came back with full intensity. "Help him." The doctor that had spoken tried to move closer to the stretcher and was held back, just as Steve and Thor had been before on the battlefield. Tony couldn't make sense of his thoughts, just as he hadn't when they'd been trying to reach Peter before, but now something clicked into place, and he realized it was Peter doing it. Somehow, impossibly, the kid was holding them back. "Talk to him, Tony," Steve commanded. "It's you he needs to hear." Tony crept closer to Peter, scared he'd be knocked back, too, and said, "Pete, kid, they're trying to help you. Let them in." The tall doctor looked between Peter and Tony and then took a hesitant step forward. When he was able to breach the point that had held him back before, he moved faster, taking the end of the stretcher and pushing it away. Steve shoved Tony forwards roughly and said, "You've got to go with them. He needs to feel safe, and apparently, you're the one that does that for him." "Safe?" Tony said doubtfully. He wasn't the one that made Peter safe. He was the one that had let him be in a battle he was too young for. He'd recruited him when he'd gone up against Steve because he'd thought the needs outweighed the risk. He believed it had to happen and that he would protect the kid. But Steve had dropped a chunk of airport on him. And Tony had not let it end there. He'd not stopped him after. He let him keep the suit, told himself it was to keep Peter safe and that he was going to monitor him with it, when he should have shut the kid down. And then he'd taken it away and Peter was left too. "Tony," Steve shouted, breaking into his tormented thoughts. "You care about that kid, right?" Tony nodded. He cared. God damn him for it. He loved Peter. He'd not seen how much until Peter was dying in his arms, drifting away, and then each day that followed he had thought of him. When he married Pepper, he'd thought of how good it would have been to have Peter there, too. When Morgan had been born, he'd wanted Peter to meet her. As Morgan had grown, Tony had wanted Peter there to share it with them. He'd not let himself think it, what he felt for the kid, but Morgan had always been told about her big brother. He told her stories about Peter and showed her photos and videos. She'd known he was the child Tony lost before she was born and that Peter loved her, even though he wasn't there. Peter had been a part of her life from the beginning, and Tony had missed him. All the joys and pains of those years, each landmark date and anniversary, each birthday party, he'd wished Peter was there. "Tony," Steve snapped. "I care," Tony said, his voice making it a confession. "Then go with him. He needs you." Tony broke his paralysis and ran forward. He stayed in step beside Peter's stretcher and said, "I'm here, Pete, I'm with you. You're safe. They're going to help you." He was apparently heard, or perhaps sensed, because they were able to move through doors and into a long room lined with hospital beds in cubicles and then to a smaller room with automatic glass doors that slid open at their approach and closed behind them. Peter was transferred onto a bed, and the stretcher was wheeled away. There was a flurry of movement around him. His suit was cut away, gelled pads placed on his chest, and a white clamp put on his index finger, which created a readout on a monitor, recording Peter's heartbeat and oxygen SATs. His heartbeat was rapid and erratic, and his oxygen levels were only 70. Tony knew enough to know that was dangerously low. "He's hypoxic," a woman dressed in blue said. "Get him on 100% oxygen," the doctor replied. A mask was placed over Peter's face and a dial turned. Tony watched Peter's breath fog the plastic with each breath, and he counted them. Breaths. Peter was breathing. As long as he continued to breathe, Tony could too. "He's called Peter?" the doctor asked, fixing his eyes on Tony. Tony nodded. "Peter Parker. He always says," he shook his head, "he's Peter." Peter's eyelids were pulled back, and light was run across them. Closer now, Tony could see what had worried Steve and Strange. His pupils were blown and showed no reaction to the light at all. There was something in them, though, that Tony leaned closer to see, disbelieving, only for an instant before being pushed back by the woman that was tending to Peter. The tiny rim of iris that should have been rich brown was a rainbow of colors Tony recognized and felt a shiver of fear for. They were the colors of the Infinity Stones. The colors of the light that he had seen move up Peter's arm, over his heart, and disappear. "What is that?" a shocked voice asked. "How can they be?" The doctor held up a finger and snapped. "Quiet." He stared at Peter for a moment and then said, "Worthy?" "He is," Tony said automatically. "Who is saying it?" The doctor shook his head. "How is he saying it?" He stared at Peter for a moment, eyes wide and disbelieving, and then he shook his head curtly and said, "Not now. We need to stabilize him. I want a full scan done." A man pulled over a white machine that looked like an X-ray, suspended from the ceiling. He positioned it over Peter and said, "Stand back." Unable to move, to risk Peter knocking them all back again, Tony said, "I'm fine. Just do it." The doctor that Tony assumed was in charge, as he had been giving the orders, nodded and said, "Do it." A button was pressed, and a blue line of light spread from Peter's feet, running up over his body to his chest, and then the light died as there was a loud bang overhead and sparks drifted down over. Tony brushed them away from Peter, scared they would burn him. But he realized they hadn't made contact with the kid's ragged suit or skin. They were suspended a few inches above him. "What is happening here?" a woman asked, aghast. The lead doctor pressed his fingers to his temples, and then his eyes drifted to Peter's arm, where the gauntlet was, and he said, "The Infinity Stones. Where are they?" Tony gasped as he realized what was wrong. The gems that had been there, embedded in the knuckles of the gauntlet, were gone. "They must have been destroyed," he said. "Thanos did it before. If that is the case, they did something to this boy first." The doctor took a breath and said, "Let's get this off." He reached for the gauntlet, his fingers holding the wrist, and then there was a strange sound like a sheet being snapped in the wind, and it slipped away. The doctor caught it and eased it away from Peter, exposing the horror beneath. Peter's hand was raw and burned with the skin scorched away and bone exposed among the ragged remains of his suit, which spread up his wrist, wounds decreasing in severity as they reached his elbow. Above that, there was a line of black in the scorched metal of his suit but no visible wounds. "Oh, Peter. The doctor paused, seeming to need a moment to gather his thoughts. "We need pain relief first." "It won't work," Tony said. "He's got crazy high metabolism. I had stuff in the lab at the compound that we'd created for him, but it's all gone." "Then we make more," the doctor said. "And we hope that he doesn't feel it now." Tony stared at Peter's face, taking in his pallor and complete absence of expression. If he was in pain, it would show, wouldn't it? He had to be under too deep to feel anything now. He had to be, as Tony couldn't bear to consider the alternative. "I want his OX/SATs up. I want blood to sequence for pain relief. The doctor sighed. "I don't think we can use technology here. We've got to do it all with the basic tools." A woman came with a capped needle and tray of vials. She snapped an elastic tourniquet around Peter's upper arm and patted the crook of his elbow to bring up a vein. When it was bulging, she lowered the needle, but before it could do more than prick his skin, her hand was knocked back, and she dropped the needle with a gasp of shock. The doctor locked eyes on Tony and growled, "What is he?" Tony answered through gritted teeth. "A damn hero. He just saved the damn world. Be that as it may, we can't help him, so you must." Tony moved closer to Peter's head and bent to whisper in his ear. "Pete, if you can hear me, you need to let them help, drop the barriers, or whatever it is you're doing." What the hell was he doing? "They need to take your blood." He nodded to the woman who was unsheathing a fresh needle, attaching a vial, and approaching cautiously. "Try now." The needle touched Peter's skin, and she was knocked back again. With a groan, Tony said, "Give it to me. Tell me what to do." The woman exchanged a look with the doctor, who nodded and said, "I don't think we've got another choice." She handed Tony the needle and said, "Pull the skin taut and insert the needle into the vein at a 20-degree angle. It will do the rest itself." Tony obeyed, pulling the skin taut, and then muttered, "I can't believe you're making me do this, kid." The needle broke the skin, and the vial began to fill with blood. He breathed a sigh of relief and watched carefully as the woman removed the first vial and replaced it with another as Tony held the needle as still as he could in the vein. When 4 vials had been filled, she said, "Take the needle out slowly." Tony eased it out and dropped it onto the extended tray as if it had burned him. He wanted it gone. The fact he'd had to do that to Peter, because he wouldn't let someone else, was frightening him. What if something happened and he needed more help? Tony wasn't a doctor. He couldn't do this stuff. Peter's hand and arm, God, those burns, were going to need treatment, and Tony was going to be helpless. He bent to Peter again and said, "You've got to work with me here, Pete. You need help that I can't give. You have to let them do it. You can trust them." "I trust them. They're not going to hurt you." He stared at Peter's face, hoping for some reaction, some sign that he was being heard. There was not even a twitch of an eyelid, but Peter's voice, strangely altered, spoke in his mind again. "Worthy." "Yes," he said, placing his hand on Peter's forehead and brushing back his hair. "They're worthy, Pete. Just like you." Though what worthy meant in this instance, he had no idea. Peter was worthy of so much. He was good and kind and brave, even stronger in heart and mind than in body. He was worthy of the world, but the word was so strange without context. It wasn't a word Peter would usually use either. It made no sense. And how was Tony even hearing it? How were any of them, when Peter was unconscious and lips not moving? That was just one of the questions he had, along with how Peter was able to hold them all back from him. Why was it that Tony was the one that could reach him, make him let them through, when he was the one that had let the kid down most of all? "Get the blood to the lab and have them work fast," the doctor said, then addressed Tony, holding up a cotton swab. "I'm going to try again, prepare him." With a heavy heart, Tony said, "Okay, kid, they're going to touch you, and it might hurt, but you've got to let them do it." He smoothed back Peter's hair again, allowing his fingers to stroke through the curls. "You have to trust me, Peter." The doctor nodded and then prodded the cotton swab at the center of the burn on Peter's arm, nudging against raw flesh. The heart monitor jumped, But the swab made contact. Peter was letting them do it. "That's it, Pete, just like that." Tony looked up and said, "Can you fix those burns?" The doctor took a long time to answer, and when he did, it wasn't the one Tony needed. "I think we can improve them somewhat, yes." "If all you can do is improve, you need a real expert," Tony said. He cupped Peter's cheek and said, "I'll be gone a minute, Pete, but I'll come right back. Let them help you. They are, worthy." The word fell awkwardly from his tongue. He forced himself to move, to break contact with the kid, and then rushed through the door that slid open at his approach, calling, "Steve?" Steve had been sitting down under a vast picture window, head bowed and cowl shed. He looked up, eyes intent, and said, "Is he awake?" "No, which is good because he's going to be in a mess of pain when he is." "His hand is." He grimaced and shook his head. "I need you to track down Helen Cho, and tell Pepper what's happening and that I'll call." "I need my phone." "I have to." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Find Cho first. We need her here." "Is it that bad?" Steve asked. Tony nodded. "I've seen some crazy stuff, bad stuff, but that kid's hand is just." Steve nodded, seeming to understand what Tony couldn't say. "I'll do it. But telling them what's happening, what do I say? Tony, what the hell is happening? What is that kid doing now?" Tony shrugged helplessly. "I don't know anymore. I don't know what he's doing or how. All I know is that he needs help, and so do I." Flying the nuke through the wormhole, he'd been lost, but that had been about him. He was the one at risk. Peter, the kid he loved, was doing these crazy things, and he was so hurt. And Tony didn't know what to do. Tony had lost track of how long he'd been there, just sitting at Peter's bedside, holding onto the kid he loved like a son and avoiding looking at the horrific state of his hand and arm. They'd covered it with a plastic case to prevent it getting dirty, and the case had a vent attached, which was soaking the hand and arm with some kind of antibiotic and anesthetic mist, but Tony didn't know if it would work on Peter. He was strong, he healed fast, but he'd never suffered these kinds of wounds before, and they were open, raw, and exposed to infection. The door opened and Steve came in. He walked slowly to the end of the bed, cautiously, and Tony said, his voice cracked with strain, "You'll be okay. He's stopped holding people back now. At least I think he has." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "I can't tell what he's doing anymore." "He's letting you close," Steve observed. Tony huffed a laugh. "Yeah, his first mistake." Steve didn't argue, not that there was any way anyone could argue against that when they saw the evidence of what Tony had caused. Steve knew Peter had been brought into the fight by Tony since it was to fight him that Tony had recruited him. He'd not known, none of them had, how young Peter had been. Now all Tony's shame was exposed in the childish curves of Peter's face. "Doctor Strange is looking for Cho," he said. "He already brought Bruce here. They're taking care of his arm. I thought I'd be more useful here." Tony raised an eyebrow. "You did? I brought your phone." He placed it on the end of the bed and bowed his head. "And I thought you might want someone to talk to." "Really, Steve, the last thing I want to do right now is talk," Tony said, the words clipped. Steve showed no sign that he'd heard the words. He took another step closer and said, "There are things we need to do, and I know now is not the perfect time, but we have to talk about them, Tony. The world is in chaos right now with everyone being brought back, and they need us, the Avengers, to show a united front." Tony started to laugh. It was a harsh and sardonic sound, incredulity laced through it. "Steve, we are never going to be a united front. The Avengers are death." He looked up, his eyes dark. "I made this kid an Avenger, and look what happened to him." Steve nodded stiffly and Tony saw the judgment in his eyes. He already saw it. He saw Peter, young, face smudged with grime from the battle and nose still bloody. "I see." "Death," Tony went on harshly. "You already know about that, though. Do you remember what you did to me when you decided to split the Avengers? Because I do. You left me for dead?" "I was protecting my fam." Before he could finish, Steve was thrown back, though the door behind him, shattering the glass, and landing 6 feet into the larger room beyond as the heart monitor gave a great leap and an alarm blared. "No, Pete," Tony said, on his feet and handcuffing Peter's face. "Calm down. It's all good. He's gone. You're safe." He heard the clink of glass as Steve got to his feet and brushed himself off. Tony looked between Steve and the kid on the bed, his own heart racing. He heard running footsteps and the man that had taken charge before, who had since introduced himself as Dr. Wikibi, skirted Steve and rushed in, shoes crunching on the glass on the floor, and came to Peter's side. He examined the monitor that was showing Peter's racing heartbeat and ordered, "Calm him, Mr. Stark." Tony leaned closer to Peter, resting his forehead against the kid's, and whispered, "You're safe. We're both safe. He's going now." Without looking back, he waved a hand at Steve to dismiss him. "He's gone." "Worthy," Tony smiled slightly. "We're still awaiting a verdict on that right now. He certainly thinks so, though." Peter's heart jumped again, and there was a shout of shock. Tony lifted his head and looked back to see that Steve was on his ass again, skidding across the floor. "Yes, he's worthy," Tony said quickly. "The Cap is worthy. You don't have to keep him away anymore." He looked back to see Steve getting to his feet and walking towards them. Tony scowled at him, warning him away, but Steve only seemed to be testing Peter's range as he got as far as the frame of the smashed door and then turned and walked away, shoulders slumped. If the situation had been any different, if Tony couldn't hear the alarmed rate of the heart monitor, it would have been funny to see Steve defeated like that. But Tony could find no humor in it. The kid was hurting himself to do whatever he was doing. He retook his seat, keeping one hand on Peter's uninjured one, thumb rubbing circles on his skin. "If you could stop doing that, Pete, that'd be great. You're hurt right now, so maybe focus on healing and leave me to keep us both safe. I'll decide who's worthy, yeah?" The alarm stopped, and Peter's heart returned to its more stable rhythm, though it was still not as even as Tony would like. "How are you doing that, Pete?" he asked. "Seriously, you were always pretty good at catching me off guard, but this is a whole new level. And you trashed a perfectly good door with that little trick. Keep it up, and I don't think they'll invite us back." Dr. Wikibi cleared his throat and said, "I was coming up to tell you that we have prepared the serum for Peter." Tony frowned. He didn't like the way the doctor had hesitated on the word. "His name is Peter." "I believe it was, yes, but I also think he is something other than a child now, if he was even that before. I think he will need a new name." Tony's color rose. "You can call him Peter Parker or Spider-Man, both are correct, but you're not going to find some new name to brand him with because of—" He waved his hand over Peter's still form. "This. You know how he got this way? He was saving the world. He saved your soldiers on that battlefield, too. Whatever he's doing now, and God knows I am just as confused as you, doesn't change anything for any of us." Peter's heart jumped again, and Tony quickly gripped his arm and said, "No, no, kid. It's okay. He's worthy. You don't have to kick him out. You don't have to kick anyone out anymore. I promise you, everyone here is worthy. None of them will hurt you or me." "Worthy?" Tony laughed despite himself, the shock of the situation starting to wear off and the reality of the sheer insanity of it settling over him. "They're all worthy. Everyone here is worthy." Peter's heart calmed as Tony patted his arm. "That's right. You're good, and now we're going to get you some treatment." Dr. Wikibi looked back and gestured with his hand to two people that had been in the trauma room before that Tony hadn't learned the names of. They gave the glass on the floor and broken door cautious looks as they came in and then stopped a foot behind the doctor. "We have created a serum that we think will relieve Peter's pain and general anesthesia so he can tend to his injury." Tony frowned. "What are you going to do to him? We need Cho. She can actually heal him, not just improve." He said the word with derision. Peter was coming out of this with a whole and healed hand. That was the only outcome Tony would accept. "Yes, and we have received a call from your specialist. She is preparing her equipment to be brought here, but she was one of the vanished, so she's also acclimatizing herself to being back and so is a little disoriented. She has asked us to clean the wound and prepare it for her arrival." He frowned slightly. "And we will need you to help us do that. Peter will be under anesthesia, but we do not know how his abilities work. We do not want to be midway through surgery when he throws us all away from him and destroys the equipment we need to treat him." "I've got to be in the OR?" Tony asked, cursing the quaver in his voice. "Is that too much to ask?" Tony glowered at him. "No, I'll be there. Whatever he needs, I'm there." The thought of having to watch while they did whatever they were going to do. And he'd seen the damage. He knew there was a lot of dead flesh to be removed. Was Do new driver? He was happy. Ask him to create an AI interface. He was in his element. But to watch someone cutting away at the kid's flesh was going to be a whole new kind of challenge. "We'll move him now," Dr. Wikibi said. "Yeah. Hold on. Give me a minute." I want to talk to Cho. He picked up his phone from the end of the bed and called up Friday. Her voice came through at once. Yes, boss? Find me Helen Cho, Friday. I'm guessing she won't have her cell with her since she's been gone 5 years, but get her. Searching for contact, Friday said. I cannot locate her yet. It will require some searching. Would you like to prepare a message for her? Yes, record now. Recording. Tony took a breath and spoke in a rush. Helen, we need you in Wakanda right now. I know you're dealing with all the crap of jumping ahead 5 years after being snapped away, but I've got a 16-year-old kid here that went through the same thing and then proceeded to save the world. Get your tech and bring it here so you can save him the rest of his life with a damn prosthetic arm. Now. He took another breath. Okay, that's done, Friday. Find her and give her the message. Play it on repeat if you need to. Just make sure she's here fast. Yes, boss. Tony tucked the phone back in his pocket, then leaned closer to Peter and said, We're going to move now. I'm going to be right there with you, and they're going to make you feel better. We'll get some painkillers in you, and you'll have a sleep, okay? Worthy, Tony stroked back his hair. You are, kid. No one has ever been more worthy than you. Tony had been instructed to change out of his own clothes and into white scrubs, which had then been covered in a gown and his hair covered with a scrub cap. He felt stupid but didn't mind in the least since this was one thing he could do to help the kid. He was given a seat beside Peter's head, opposite to where they would be working on his hand and arm. Peter was sedated now, and he'd been given pain relief, which had made his heart rate a little steadier. We're starting, Dr. Wikibe warned and then turned to the woman in full surgical gear beside him and said, Laser scalpel. Tony saw a strange instrument being handed to him. It looked like a silver pen with an unusually pointed tip, but with the click of the button, a thin blue line of light came from the tip. Dr. Wikibe pointed it at Peter's ravaged hand, and smoke rose. Tony quickly looked away, but he could smell it, and it made him feel sick. It wasn't quite charred flesh, it was more metallic, but it still made him feel like he was going to be sick, though what he would lose, he had no idea because he couldn't even remember the last time he'd eaten. When this was over, when Peter had 2 working hands, Tony was buying them both the biggest cheeseburgers money could buy. Or he'd make them himself. He could cook now. He'd learned in the years Peter had been gone and Tony's life had become domesticity. Or maybe they'd get one of those sandwiches Peter loved from that place in Queens. If it was even there anymore. Had the man? Was Delmar his name? He couldn't remember. Been one of the vanished? Or had the business not survived the sudden loss of half of its customers? A lot of places hadn't. Prepare for deeper incisions, Dr. Wikibe said. Tony fixed his eyes on Peter's lax face, his lips parted by the tube that fed oxygen directly into his lungs. He looked peaceful, pale and sick but peaceful, but when the smell increased, Peter's heartbeat lurched and sped. What? Tony said dumbly, looking around to see if anyone had been knocked back again. They were still there, but they were watching Peter cautiously. I thought you put him under? We did, the anesthesiologist behind Peter's head, monitoring the machines and tubes feeding into Peter said. But he's not a normal patient. Tony's anger rose. He is normal. Whatever he's doing now, how we can hear him and how he's knocking people back, is not his fault. It is happening because he saved the world. We know, Dr. Wikibe calmly. What we are saying is that he is not a normal human. We followed Spider-Man's progress before the snap, saw his abilities, and you said yourself that his metabolism is different. Tony breathed deep, some of the anger seeping out of him to be replaced with worry. So, you can't put him under enough that it won't hurt? Dr. Wikibe shook his head. Apparently not, and we can't risk more, the anesthesiologist said. You will have to help him, Mr. Stark, Dr. Wikibe said. It's you that has reached and calmed him so far. Talk to him now. Let him hear your voice. Tony bent close to Peter's ear. Okay, kid, I know you're in pain right now, and you're scared, but this will be over soon. He darted his eyes up to Dr. Wikibe and narrowed them in a warning. Then you'll be able to rest. Okay. Just try to block it out. Use all the strength I know you've got and focus on me. He stroked Peter's cheek with his gloved finger. I'll fill you in on everything you missed. And it's a lot, so strap in and get comfy. It's quite the story. Dr. Wikibe nodded, eyes on the monitor. It's working, keep going. Tony rested his head on the bed beside Peter's and said, Okay, First things first, I've got a daughter. She's called Morgan, and I swear, Pete, she's even more work than you. I thought you kept me busy, but this girl, she's a lot like her mom, stubborn as all hell and cute as a button. And she's damn smart, too. Give her a few more years, and she'll be in the lab with you and me, making alterations on your suit that make what I come up with look like a science fair project. The sounds around them, the smells, remained, but Tony found it easier to block them out as he spoke to Peter, soothing him in the only way he knew how. And your buddy Ned, the hellion that hacked my suit, which I'm still mad about so you know, was one of the vanished, too. When things settle, when we get you back to that school of yours, you'll have a buddy to come up with your plots to turn my hair gray, and, Another fact of the years Peter missed occurred to him, and he swallowed hard. He couldn't tell Peter his aunt had died, not like this. It had been a simple twist of fate, a car accident on the way to work, but she was gone. Tony had lost direct contact with her after the snap, the loss of Peter and her reaction creating a gulf them instead of a bond. But Tony had tracked her through happy. He'd made sure she had the best funeral money could buy, arranged by her friends from the hospital as she'd lost all other family before and because of the snap, and he'd stood by her grave at Happy's side with the other mourners. He'd apologized for bringing her kid into the fight and hoped she would hear him. Mr. Stark, Dr. Wikibi said warningly as Peter's heart rate began to climb again. Tony cleared his throat, dug down for strength, and said, MJ vanished, too, so you've got that to look forward to. I can't wait to hear your rambling stories about how she laughed at one of your jokes again. He ran a finger over Peter's cheek and took another breath. As soon as this is over, when you're back on your feet, you and me are going back to the lab and working on your suit. He huffed a laugh. I might actually need to build a new lab. I've not got much of one at home. Me, Pep, and Morgan are out of the city in this nice place by the lake right now, actually. I think you'll like it. You'll definitely get a kick out of how domestic it is. I can cook, and I got an alpaca called Gerald. Pepper hates him. Anyway, since the compound blew, I lost most of my stuff. But that's okay. You and me can start over. I think that, between the two of us, we can have some fun building it up again. That sound good, kid? You want to do that with me? He stared at Peter, willing an answer that told him Peter could hear him, to confirm what he hoped his calmer heart rate meant. Even that word that he still couldn't make sense of, worthy. What did he even mean? Would be enough. Plead into Peter's ear. Give me something. Just a flicker. He sat up and picked up Peter's free hand. Squeeze it or something, a twitch will do. I know you're feeling stuff, so you've got to be hearing it, so let me know you're okay in there, please. Tony stared at Peter, desperate for something, and then his heart picked up and his breaths caught as he heard the voice. The right voice. It wasn't formal, it wasn't wrong and the polar opposite of the Peter he knew and loved. It was weak and tired, but the real Peter. I'm here, Mr. Stark, it's okay. Tony dropped his head onto Peter's chest, breathing through his nose to keep himself in control and to not break down, and he whispered, Thank you, Peter. God, thank you. Wow, this hurts, Peter said. Or did he say it? He had no lips to speak anymore. They had burned away, so how was he talking? How was he doing anything at all? But if he had burned away, why did his hand hurt so much? He thought he'd died. The pain and the burning away of his flesh he'd felt had to be fatal. And he'd felt that peace after, sinking into nothingness without fear. That was dying, right? So why could he still talk? Was this some kind of heaven or strange limbo between life and death? If it was heaven, it was kinda a disappointment. He was alone, which sucked. You are not alone. We are here, the voice intoned, and you are worthy. Yeah, you said that, but what does it mean? You know what, I don't care. Do you know if I'm dead? That'd be good to know right now. I mean, there was no white light to walk into or anything, which I was kinda expecting. And if I'm not dead, which would be pretty awesome, what am I? You are not dead. You are worthy. Peter sighed. That's really helpful, good to know. I've always wondered if I was. And since we're apparently stuck on the topic, what exactly does worthy mean? It means everything. Sounds broke into Peter's distraction, and he stopped flipping through all the curses he knew in all the languages. MJ was great with languages, especially the good words, and she'd been teaching Peter to throw at that voice and listened. What's happening? Why can't we move past? He knew that voice. It was Thor. Okay, So probably not dead. Unconscious maybe. That would make sense. God, his hand hurt. What did they mean they couldn't move, though? Was something holding them back? What if it was Thanos? Damn. Peter had thought the whole snap thing would have gotten rid of him. If he was still there, that meant they were all in trouble. God, Mr. Stark could be hurt. He is not worthy. Okay, you can stop with that right now. You obviously know nothing. Mr. Stark is like the worthiest person. Seriously. What do you know, anyway? You're just some voice in my head. Probably some chemicals firing off because of the pain. And God, the pain, I am not just a voice, I am mind. Peter snorted. You're not really helping yourself with that statement, you know? You're just my mind screwing up. You will learn the truth. Sure, I will. Try Mjolnir, a voice suggested. Wait, what? Peter asked. Try what with Mjolnir? Something slammed into his chest with the force of a speeding truck. Strangely, it didn't hurt nearly as much as his hand did, which it should have since the force would have to have cracked every rib. This was more like getting stitches once you'd been numbed. He'd had it once, when he fell over screwing around with Ned. Long before Spider-Man and the amazing and useful healing abilities. And cut his arm open on broken glass. He'd needed 7 stitches, which he'd watched being put in with detachment. He'd seen it happening, felt the tugging, but it hadn't hurt the way it should. Did Thor just hit me with his hammer? He asked. Not that it's not cool and all. And Ned would get a kick out of it. Ned? Was he snapped, too? Oh God. Is my best friend in college now? That would be all kinds of complicated. He won't want to hang out with a kid, or maybe he would. He's pretty cool. I'd hang out with him if he was a kid, I'd. Peter, a voice whispered. Peter, please. Peter felt a wave of horror. It was Tony, and whatever had happened, he sounded wrecked. Was he hurt? God, if something had happened to him. Peter had to wake up. He needed to get to him. Again, Tony. A voice spoke, and this time Peter recognized it as Captain America. Of course, he was the one that told Thor to use his hammer. What? Tony asked, sounding so lost. Say something to him. But he's dead, Peter suggested. I'm not sure if I am, Mr. Stark. I don't think so. Unless this is what death is, hanging around your body forever. And if that was it, which would suck, what would happen if he was cremated? Would he just continue to drift around without a tether, like a ghost? Or would he be cancelled out? Just do it, Captain America snapped. Peter, it's me, I'm coming. Tony sounded a little better now, less wrecked. Peter was pretty sure he wasn't hurt, but something had upset him. You have upset him. Wait, what did I do? More importantly, how did he fix it again? He is upset because you're worthy. Captain America spoke again, and Peter stopped trying to make sense of what his mind was saying to him. Yeah, you are, kid. You really are. Wait, did they hear you? Peter asked. Can they hear me? He spoke louder. Hey, Mr. Stark, Captain, if you can hear me, can you maybe get me something for the pain? Or what? Tony asked. Worthy, don't listen to him, Peter said urgently. Listen to me. I'm not being a baby or anything, but my hand really does hurt, and since you had the lab cook up that, oh. No more lab. No more super drugs for me. Man, that sucks. You should rest. Yeah, I would if my damn hand didn't hurt so. Before he could finish, he felt a strange heaviness settle over him, different to falling asleep and different from how he'd felt when he snapped the gauntlet. This was faster and also less peaceful. He could still hear the sounds around him, and he wanted to answer, but he lost his grip on his own mind and went under. When Peter surfaced, it was Captain America talking again. He's letting you close. Letting who close? Peter asked. Hey, mind voice, do you know what they're talking about? Yes. You have been protecting yourself quite well. Tony Stark is the only one you will let close freely. He's the only one you'll listen to. Duh, that's because he's the smart one, the worthy one. He heard Tony give a short laugh. Yeah, his first mistake. Wait, what? Mistake? No, seriously, Mr. Stark, letting you close was the best. I just want you to know, if I don't wake up or if I die or whatever, you really were the best choice. Totally. You were great, damn it, why can't you hear me? Doctor Strange and Bruce are looking for Cho, Captain America said. I thought I'd be more useful here. You did? Peter wasn't surprised to hear the doubt in Tony's voice. He would have expected Captain America to take off now the fight was over. And it had to be over. There was no way they'd be talking like this, near Peter, if it was still going on. The snap had worked, which was a massive relief because if it had failed and Peter was stuck like this for nothing, well, it would suck. I brought your phone, and I thought you might want someone to talk to. Peter scoffed. Peter didn't know exactly what had happened between them after Tony went after Captain America, but he knew that it had gotten bad. Happy had let slip, after admittedly a lot of questioning, that Tony had been seriously hurt. If the captain thought Tony wanted to talk to him. Honestly, Cap, you're the last person I want to talk to, Tony said, the words clipped. Peter chuckled. He was pleased Tony was speaking up, though not surprised because Tony always said what he was thinking about other people when they were pissing him off. Peter should know. He'd pissed Tony off pretty badly in the past, too. Apparently, Captain America was deaf or stupid as his voice moved closer, and he said, "There are things we need to do, and I know now is not the perfect time, but we have to talk about them, Tony. The world is in chaos right now with everyone being brought back, and they need us, the Avengers, to show a united front." Tony started to laugh in a way that showed he was in no way actually amused. This was bitter and incredulous. Peter didn't blame him. Captain America was clearly crazy. Not that the Avengers being together again wouldn't be cool, it would, and being on the battlefield with them had been great apart from the whole being terrified thing. But he'd hurt Tony. Peter had never mentioned Captain America's name after when he was invited to spend time in the lab with Tony at the compound. Both because he wasn't Stu warned him away from the topic, saying Tony broke whatever he was holding when he heard it. "Steve, we are never going to be a united front. The Avengers are death. I made this kid an Avenger, and look what happened to him." "No," Peter said. "It's not your fault. I did what I had to do. And you tried to send me home before Thanos. It's the fact you made the suit too smart, which was technically your fault since it knew what I wanted and helped, but I wanted to be there, Mr. Stark. It was my fight, too. This is in no way your fault." "I see," Captain America said mildly. "You see nothing," Peter snapped. "This is on me." "Death," Tony went on. "You already know about that, though. Do you remember what you did to me when you decided to split the Avengers? Because I do. You left me for dead. I was protecting my fam." Peter felt a wave of anger that made his heart race and his chest burn with pain. He felt something explode out of him like a punch, and then there was a crashing sound and tinkling glass. What was that?" he asked. "That was you protecting the people you love. That is why you are worthy." "I did that? What did I do? Is Mr. Stark okay?" "He is fine." As if to back up the voice's words, Tony started to speak again. "No, Pete. Calm down. It's all good, he's gone. You're safe." There was the sound of footsteps, and a deep-voiced man spoke harshly, giving an order. "Calm him, Mr. Stark." Tony's voice came softly, a whisper, but Peter thought he'd moved. "You're safe. We're both safe. He's going now. He's gone." "Worthy," the voice said wonderingly. "Really not," Peter answered. Tony smiled slightly. "We're still awaiting a verdict on that right now. He certainly thinks so, though." Peter felt that punch from his chest again, and there was a shout of shock. "Yes, he's worthy," Tony rushed on. "The Cap is worthy. You don't have to keep him away anymore." "What is happening?" Peter asked. "Come on, mind voice. You seem to know more than me, so explain. Did I do something to the captain?" "I know infinitely more than you, I am endless, but you will learn when you're ready." "Sure, okay, I'll learn, but did I hurt the captain? I'm not complaining if I did, because he's kinda an ass, hurting Mr. Stark, but I'd like to know what's going on if it was me. I don't want to do it to someone else and hurt them." "You did it, yes, and you will learn control of it. That is something you can learn from Soul, as it is that element that's driving your instincts to protect the people you care about." "Then can I talk to Soul? Or my soul? Honestly, I'm kind of freaking out right now. I didn't even know I had a soul." "It is not your soul, though you have one, and it is worthy of us. You cannot learn now or access the others as you are lost in your own mind still. That will end. You just need time and rest." Before Peter could answer, to ask another question or maybe plead for some help, Tony spoke. "If you could stop doing that, Pete, that'd be great. You're hurt right now, so maybe focus on healing and leave me to keep us both safe. I'll decide who's worthy, yeah?" "Sure, Mr. Stark," Peter said. "I mean, I'll try. I'm not sure what's going on, though. This is all kinda weird, and my hand really hurts." Then you should rest again. You do not need to be afraid. We will protect you as you protect yourself." Yeah, that all sounds great and all, but before he could finish, he was overwhelmed again and slipping back into nothingness. When Peter rose again, he could hear Tony's voice. His hand was searing even more as if someone was cutting into it, and he could feel pressure points in the pain, which made him think they were at least touching it. "Oh, man," he muttered. "Did I have to be awake for this part? What are they even doing to me?" "They are operating on your hand to prepare the site for further treatment from Dr. Helen Cho." "Okay, that's good, I guess, but couldn't I have slept through it?" "You were the one that chose to wake. We are not in control of that." "So, I can go under again?" "You can, but we believe you should hear." "Maybe later. I'm going to get away for a while. I've just got to." He willed it to work, to slip below the surface again, but it was impossible with the stabs of pain in his hand and Tony's voice in his ear. "And your buddy Ned, the hellion that hacked my suit, which I'm still mad about so you know, was one of the vanished, too. When things settle, when we get you back to that school of yours, you'll have a buddy to come up with your plots to turn my hair gray, and what?" Peter asked. "Really, Mr. Stark? Finish a sentence or stop talking altogether so I can go under again, please. Damn, this hurts." "Mr. Stark," that deep voice from before said. Peter heard a throat being cleared, and then Tony went on. "MJ was vanished, too, so you've got that to look forward to. I can't wait to hear your rambling stories about how she laughed at one of your jokes again." "That's good," Peter said, able to think around the pain a little more now he was growing accustomed to it. "I'll have Ned and MJ. Or will I? Hey, mind voice. Do I get to actually wake up properly soon? You are the one in control of that. None of us is body. I believe, though, that your body is keeping you in this state to protect you from pain." Peter flinched. "You mean it's going to hurt even more than I wake up?" "No, your hand should be healed soon. It's the reality you are as yet unaware of that your body is protecting you. You will feel us." "Feel you what?" "You will feel us being helpful," Peter said bitterly, and then tuned back into Tony's voice. "As soon as this is over, when you're back on your feet, you and me are going back to the lab and working on your suit. I might actually need to build a new lab. I've not got much of one at home. Me, Pep, and Morgan are out of the city in this nice place by the lake right now. Actually, I think you'll like it." Peter returned himself to the voice that seemed to know so much. "Who's Morgan?" "Tony and Pepper Stark's daughter. He's got a kid. Wow, that's awesome. I wonder if I'll get to meet her." "I am almost certain you will. Just because he is not worthy." "You can quit saying that," Peter snapped. "It does not mean that his soul does not speak to us. You are very loved by Tony Stark." Peter had no response for a moment as there was a kind of war being waged inside him. Was it possible Tony loved him? He liked him. Sure, he must because he was always letting Peter hang around the workshop, and he invited him over for pizza and movies other times, so Peter figured he had to like him a little, but love? "Seriously?" he asked. "It is an exceptionally strong soul connection. Especially now that you are here again and his own soul is not defending him." Peter loved Tony. He loved him as much as he loved anyone. The time he got to spend with him was a gift, every minute, and he was always conscious that it might end, that he might mess up again and lose Tony altogether instead of just the suit. But if Tony actually loved him? He drifted back into Tony's words, enjoying the sound of his voice. "Domestic it is. I can cook, and I got an alpaca called Gerald. Pepper hates him. Anyway, since the compound blew, I lost most of my stuff. But that's okay. You and me can start over. I think that, between the two of us, we can have some fun building it up again. That sound good, kid? You want to do that with me?" "Yes," Peter said fervently. "I'll do whatever you want, build whatever you need. I've just got to wake up first." "He is reaching for you. He's what?" "Please, kid," Tony whispered. "Give me something. Just a flicker. Squeeze my hand or something, a twitch will do. I know you're feeling stuff, so you've got to be hearing it, so let me know you're okay in there, please." "Do you feel that? Are you ready to touch it?" "Feel what?" Peter asked. He's upset. "Shut up and let me think. His soul is calling for you. Reach back to him." Peter had no idea what he was doing. When he couldn't move or be heard when he spoke, but he forced the words out with all the strength he had, willing Tony to hear them, stilted as they were. "I'm here, Mr. Stark, it's okay. There was a pause, and then Tony's fervent whisper and noisy breaths. "Thank you, Peter. God, thank you." "He heard me, right?" Peter asked. "He can hear me?" "He heard you, and your soul touched his. You did well. You are strong as well as worthy." "Great," Peter sighed. "That's great. Hey, can you put me out again? I'm really tired, and my hand is—" He didn't finish. He was already gone. "Boy, my hand hurts." "You have said that many times." "Well, since you're my head talking, you should know it's true," Peter said irritably. "It really hurts. You know, I am not your head speaking. I am not an inner consciousness of you. I am my own being. You going to tell me what that means? When you are ready to know, you will ask properly." Peter huffed out a breath. "Do I need to ask in Spanish to get an answer? Or French? They're all I know. Though I can curse at you in about a dozen other languages, and some of them are pretty cool. It is not a matter of the language you use. You or I are beyond mortal languages now." Peter didn't like the sound of that. It had the sense of foreboding, so he dismissed it and concentrated on what he could control, which, admittedly, wasn't much. He was pretty limited to talking to the voice in his head, and that was frustrating. He wanted to be awake and talking to others. He wanted to know what had happened after the snap. It was over, that much he knew since Tony was with him, but was everyone else okay? "Hey, mind voice, can you wake me up?" "No," the voice said serenely, and Peter sighed. "But you can wake yourself up. You're the one in control now. You have new depths of power you never had before, in fact. You will need to learn to harness them if you are going to use them properly." "Use them for what? I am not the one to ask. You need power for that." Peter sputtered. But you just said I had power." "You have power, but you are not power embodied. When you are ready to see him, you will." "Okay, fine, I'll put that on the to-do list. Let's start with waking up, though. How do I do that?" "How do you usually do it?" the voice asked. "I have never experienced sleep. I am mind." "I don't know. It kinda just happens. I guess sometimes I need to pee, which helps, but otherwise, it's automatic when I've had enough sleep." "Have you had enough sleep now?" "Definitely. And maybe if I wake up, I can get something for the pain." "Then wake." Peter was getting annoyed. The voice, whatever it was less than helpful. It spoke in riddles that Peter was too worn down for. "How do I do it?" he snapped. "Listen." Grumbling, Peter obeyed and then heard a whisper of sound that grew louder as he focused. It was a rhythmic beeping and deep snores. May snored, though she denied it when Peter pointed it out. The walls in the apartment were thin, though, and he could hear her when he laid in bed at night or came home from school after her night shifts. Reach for the sound. Peter did, willing himself awake the way he'd willed Tony to hear him before, and he felt the fog lifting, sounds coming louder. His eyes blinked open only to squeeze shut again as the light blinded him. He tentatively cracked them to let himself get used to the light again, and then, when they'd stopped burning, he looked around. The snoring was coming from Tony, who was slumped in a chair beside the bed Peter was lying on. His chin was resting on his chest, and his eyes were ringed with shadows. Peter just stared at him for a moment, taking in the sight and relief to have him there again, and then he appraised the rest of his surroundings. The room he was in was large with vast windows which let in the light which had blinded him. There was a monitor beside the bed, which was making the beeping sound he'd heard before, connected to his bare chest by pads. There was a white clamp on his index finger and a tube in the back on his hand that was connected to a bag that hung above Tony's head. Peter looked to the other side, and his breath caught. His hand, the one that had worn the gauntlet, was in some kind of box with clear sides that seemed to be drenched in some sort of mist, but through the mist, Peter could see red and white of flesh and bone. "Whoa," he said. "What the hell happened to me? The use of the gauntlet came at a price. I believe you will be healed with the help of Helen Cho's technology." Peter considered the words and then shrugged without answering. Speaking to himself, or the voice in his head, had seemed okay when no one else was listening, but he wasn't sure he wanted to do it when he might be overheard. He already had a lot to face without people thinking he was crazy, too. The fact he'd been outed in front of the Avengers as a kid was definitely going to create some questions. Captain America already seemed annoyed. "Your age will be the least of their concerns now." Peter reached his free hand off the bed, weak and shaking, and prodded Tony's shoulder. "Hey, Mr. Stark, I'm awake, and if there's something I can get for the pain, that'd be great. I know we don't have the super stuff anymore, since the lab blew up, but maybe we can just try a bottle of Tylenol. I'm pretty sure I can handle it." Tony continued to snore loudly, and Peter gave a small laugh. "So, you're a snorer. I wouldn't have guessed it. I guess I thought you seemed too cool to snore. That's dumb, right?" "Yeah, it's dumb. But if you could wake up." The clamp on his finger snagged on the sleeve of the strange white shirt Tony was wearing. Was he really wearing scrubs? And slipped off, triggering an alarm from the monitor beside the bed. Tony's eyes flew open, and he jumped to his feet, his eyes snapping between the monitor and Peter, breaths coming quick. He didn't seem to notice Peter was awake at first, and when his eyes locked on Peter's, they widened and his lips parted. "Hey," Peter said. "Peter?" "Yeah." To Peter's shock, Tony fell back into the chair and dropped his head into his hands, his breaths coming even faster and shoulders juddering. Peter's brow scrunched. "You okay, Mr. Stark?" Tony's hands dropped, and he raised his head. Peter was astounded to see that his eyes were wet. "What's wrong, Mr. Stark?" Tony made a strange choking sound that wasn't quite a laugh or sob and said, "You, kid, you sure know how to keep me on my toes." He stood, and his warm hand fell on Peter's shoulder and squeezed. "How are you feeling?" Peter shrugged and then flinched as his wounded hand moved in the case covering it, skin nudging against the side. "It kinda hurts," he said, and then mulled over the understatement, "It hurts a lot." Tony's face fell. "I'll see if we can give you something more for the pain. They made something that should work for you like the stuff we had cooked up in the lab, but your wounds are." Peter nodded. "Yeah, I figure they're pretty bad. Even not seeing them properly, I can tell they're gross. That's what happens when you put on a gauntlet carrying the world's most powerful weapons and snap your fingers, kid." Peter's lips turned down. "I'm sorry, but I had to." "I know," Tony sighed. "I get it. I hate that you did it, damn it, it should have killed you." He bit his lip, but it didn't. "Nope. It's all good. Apart from, my hand and all." Tony nodded quickly. "Yeah. Sorry. Give me a minute. Don't go throwing anyone around while I'm gone." "Throwing anyone around?" Peter asked. Tony held up a hand. "Painkillers first, explanations later." He ducked out of the room, and the door slid closed behind him. Mind voice?" Peter whispered. "Do you know what he's talking about? I told you that you were protecting the people you loved. You were also protecting yourself." "The whole chest punch thing?" "Yes. You were able to use the force of power to send them away from you. You threw Captain America through a glass door." "I did what? How did?" He cut off as Tony came back in with a man dressed in white scrubs like Tony's, though he was a much larger man than Tony, tall and imposing, which didn't make him look as strange as Tony in them. He also looked wary, like he was appraising Peter as a threat. "Pete, this is Dr. Wakibi. He's been taking care of you." "Thank you," Peter said cautiously, not comfortable with the way the doctor was looking at him. "You are in pain?" the doctor asked. "Yeah." The doctor checked the monitor beside the bed and said, "We can give more now that you're stabler," and took out a syringe, then carried it over to the bed and injected it into the tube in the back of Peter's hand. Peter felt a wave of relief almost as once as the drugs spread through him, edging away the pain and making his muscles feel loose and soft. "Thanks," he sighed. Tony laughed. "Yeah, I think that's done it." Peter nodded lazily. "Much better." Dr. Wakibi nodded and strode out again, Peter's drowsy eyes following him. Tony sat down in the chair again, picked up Peter's hand and squeezed it, and then caught Peter's eyes and placed it back down on the bed and tucked his own hands in his lap. Peter was disappointed, as Tony was so warm and it had felt nice, but he figured Tony was a little uncomfortable with the touch. After all, they were only just there with hugs now. "You scared the crap out of me, kid," Tony said. "I'm sorry," Peter said automatically. "I didn't mean to." Tony laughed. "I'll take the apology, since you really did scare me, but you don't need to apologize for what you did. You saved the damn world. I thought it was on me, but you." "Did I mess up?" Peter asked. "Was it supposed to be you? But I don't know, stole it? Because I didn't know. I just thought." He winced. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Tony raised his hand as if he was going to touch him, and then dropped it again and said, "You stole nothing. You did something amazing. You saved my life and the lives of everyone I care about." I'd obviously rather you hadn't got hurt doing it, but," he rubbed the back of his neck, "thanks, kid." Peter felt his lips tug up in a smile. He had a warm feeling in his chest. Tony said he had saved the world, but that was way too big to think about. But saving Tony's life felt like it could be real. He'd definitely have wanted to do it. "Cool," he said. Tony laughed again. "You save the world, or a bona fide hero that does something amazing, and you say, 'Cool'? Really, kid, you're all kinds of special." "Worthy." "Shut up," Peter muttered. Tony frowned. "What?" Peter quickly shook his head. "Nothing, sorry. I was talking to myself. And it is cool. I thought looking out for the little guy was neat, but that battle was. Well, it was terrifying, but also kinda amazing. I mean, you were all there. All the Avengers and superheroes, and I was fighting with you. You saved us," Tony said seriously. "And not one of us is going to forget it." His lips pressed into a thin line for a moment, and then he added, "I'll make sure of it." "Okay," Peter said, eyes starting to drift closed again as the drugs seeped deeper into his system. "Sleep," Tony said. "You need it. We're going to take care of your hand as soon as Cho gets here and sets up. Get some rest, and we can talk later." Peter nodded. "Sure, okay." He let his eyes fall closed and then smiled as he felt his hand being picked up again and a thumb smoothing circles on his skin. Maybe they were there now for hand-holding, too. "Thanks, Mr. Stark," he sighed. "Kid, can you do me a favor?" Peter forced his eyes open. "Sure." Tony smiled down at him and gave his hand a brief squeeze. "Make it Tony." Peter smiled. "Sure thing, Mr. Stark." Tony laughed, and his hand settled in Peter's hair, fingers stroking his scalp. "You're impossible, kid." Peter tried to respond, but he was already slipping under again. "Yes, impossible," the voice whispered. "New and impossible, but also worthy." Steve was sitting with his head in his hands under the high windows. Tony was with Spider-Man, Peter he was called, but Steve could wrap his mind around that fact since the realization that he was just a kid carried a lot of guilt for him. He could have killed him in Germany. Then he'd seen him on the battlefield against Thanos' army, seen how young he was, and he'd not stepped in. What kind of protector was he when he fought side by side with a kid and saw the ends as justifying the means? And then he'd done worse. He'd seen the kid with the gauntlet, but he'd not done anything. He'd been fighting a group of Thanos Chitauri, attention half on the battle and half on the kid. And in that moment, when he'd seen the child put on the gauntlet and known what he was going to do and what it would cost, he'd not thought of stepping in. He'd watched and waited for a kid to die for the sake of everyone else. Captain America, Solider and Protector, didn't even try to stop a child essentially killing himself to win a war. He'd put the mission first. He shook his head and pushed away the thoughts. The kid was alive. Steve got him breathing right again and arranged for him to be brought to medical care when Tony had been frozen by shock, and whatever connection he felt to the kid, he'd done his best. At least what was what he told himself. He was waiting for the Quinjet to arrive with the other survivors. He needed them there to ground him since he was struggling and unable to find his inner calm the way he used to. He'd been waiting for hours, long after they took the kid to surgery and brought him back again, but Steve wasn't allowed closer. Tony had made his feelings clear, and so had the kid. Somehow, he'd thrown Steve out on his ass. That was too much to think about right now, how he was capable of it, so Steve focused on himself instead, breathing, being calm, not tearing himself apart with well-deserved guilt. He heard the engine, and his head snapped to the window to see the jet appear and touch down. Relieved and unable to wait, he got to his feet and watched as people filed out of the back. And Thor and Helen Cho lifted out equipment and were met by Shuri and Bruce, his arm in a sling. Steve felt a twist in his stomach at the sight of it, the cradle, as he remembered what it had done last time and what it was capable of. But he knew the kid was seriously injured since he'd heard it discussed and figured her technology was going to be vital to heal him. The thought of that kid needing a prosthetic arm like Bucky was abhorrent. How old could he even be? 16 at the most. As they drifted towards the palace and out of sight, Steve sat down again and waited for them. It didn't take long. Rhodey was first in, and he strode to Steve and asked, "Where's Tony?" "With Spider-Man," Steve said. Rhodey scowled. "His name is Peter, though I can see why you'd not want to see it. And where are they?" His voice was a growl that made Steve blink up at him and then point to the door that would lead to the room he'd been thrown out of. Rhodey strode away, and Steve stood to greet Wanda, Sam, Thor, and Bucky. Bucky came straight to him, clapped a hand on his shoulder, and then said, "What's going on?" "They operated on the kid, and Tony is with him now. I don't know what's going on now. I can't get close." Thor frowned. "He's still keeping people away. I don't know about everyone else, but he knocked me through a glass door to get rid of me." Bucky ran a hand through his hair and fell into a chair. "This is just crazy. How is he even doing that? They were tracking him here, watching what he was doing, and he never showed powers like that before. He was just swinging around and throwing webs at people. He never showed this kind of ability." Steve sat down beside him and said, "I have no idea." Wanda took a seat opposite them, face drawn and eyes distant, and Sam sat with her and placed a hand on her arm that she shrugged away. She was hurting still, Steve knew, from the loss of vision. It made a question occur to him. "Clint?" "Gone home," Sam said. "God knows he needed to, his family." Steve nodded, thinking of all the reunions and griefs happening over the world right now. There was going to be joy and pain. So many people would be coming back to find their family had been lost in the 5 years they'd been gone. "Does anyone know what even happened?" Bucky asked. "I know the kids snapped, and that wiped them out, but, after, how did he live?" He ran a hand through his hair. "Look what that thing did to Bruce, and the Hulk is basically created to handle that kind of power. Peter is just a kid." Steve pinched the bridge of his nose. "I wish I knew." "Don't we all?" Stephen Strange said, sweeping into the room. "I do know a touch more than you, though." All eyes found him, and Thor said, "Please, go ahead," from his place leaning against the window. "I saw over 14 million possible outcomes for the battle," he said. "In many of them, Tony Stark was the crux of the plan, and he failed in all but one future. If he had gone ahead with his path, he would have saved us all and died for it." Steve flinched. "Tony would have died. He would. But the kid took that path from him. And I do not understand how. There was an outcome I was not aware of, that the Time Stone did not see, and that was that the kid would save us and live. It should not have been possible. The power of the stones is absolute." "The kid is called Peter," a voice growled from the door. Rhodey came in, face thunderous, and said, "Peter Parker, he is 16 years old." "You say that like it makes it better," Bucky said. "We knew he was young. You just had to hear him chatting away when we were in Germany to know that. But he is a kid. How could Tony have brought him into that fight?" His hands fisted. "Any one of us could have killed him? Was he disposable to Tony?" For a moment, Steve thought Rhodey was going to launch himself at Bucky, and it was only the knowledge that Bucky could more than handle himself that kept him in his seat. Rhodey took a deep breath in what Steve thought was a failed attempt to calm himself and then said, "He was not disposable to anyone. When I found out what Tony had done in Germany, I was pissed, too. I saw all the danger to the kid. I chalked it up to Tony being an arrogant asshole again, thought he'd slipped back a decade in emotional growth, but I was wrong. Yeah, he brought Peter into a big fight against you guys when he had no right to, but he loves him. You don't know since you weren't there." His voice was an accusation. "But Tony took care of him after Germany. They had something special. I've known Tony for years, and I'd never seen him connect that hard and fast with someone. Peter is a hero." Sam held up a hand. "None of us are denying that. Hell, the kid, Peter, saved the world, but he should never have been in a position to. The fact Tony cares about him makes it even worse." Rhodey glowered. "And do you really think he doesn't know that? I have seen Tony hurting before, and I've seen him happy, but those years after the snap, for every time I saw Tony happy, I saw him sad, too. He broke completely when he came back from Titan without Peter, and it took Morgan to bring him back from the brink. He didn't talk about Peter much to me. I think it hurt him, but when he did, though was damn proud of Peter. He made a mistake bringing him into that fight. I know that, and Tony does, too. But look at what was achieved through it. Because Peter was one of us, because he was there, he saved us, saved everyone, and lived. Which he should never have been able to do," Dr. Strange said. "The power of the stones is absolute." "So, he's strong," Bucky said. "Which is great." Dr. Strange's features became pinched and annoyed. 14 million possible futures with only one victory at Tony Stark's hands and death. To break that, to create a new future and survive the stones, is more than strong. That child is impossible. A somber silence fell over the room, and Rhodey looked out of the window. What has it cost him? Steve asked Doctor Strange. The things he was doing. The power he was showing. He knocked Thor on his ass. What does that mean for him? I don't know, Doctor Strange said. I cannot see without the time stone. What happened to the stones? They weren't in the gauntlet on the boy, Wanda asked quietly, and Steve could hear the grief in her voice. He was sure she was thinking of only one stone, the one connected to Vision, who Steve knew she had loved. Vision, like Natasha, was lost to this fight, and somehow, impossibly, Peter Parker had lived when he was the least likely of them all to survive. He was so young. We can't find them, Doctor Strange said. Peter Quill is searching the battlefield for signs of them. He has a connection to them, at least to the Power Stone, that should help him to find them if they exist. It is possible that they were destroyed, though. Thanos was able to do that by using their own power, Dr. Banner said. Perhaps it was an incidental outcome of being used again for them to perish. Steve nodded, remembering the trials and losses they'd suffered to gather them again. There was movement at the door, and Bruce came in. Before anyone could question him, he said, Dr. Cho is setting up her equipment in the lab. How's the kid? Peter, Steve corrected as Rhodey's color rose. Bruce frowned. Okay, Peter, how is he? Rhodey sighed. His hand is a mess, but Cho should be able to fix that. He's unconscious, which Tony says is good since he's in pain. I didn't stay with them since Tony was radiating the whole get away from my kid thing. His kid? Bucky said doubtfully. Rhodey nodded. Yeah, I don't know if he admits it to himself, but the way Tony is about Morgan is the same way he is about Peter. And he's pretty high-strung right now, so maybe keep your distance. Steve gave a short laugh. No problem for me. Last time I got too close to them, I was thrown through a door. Doctor Strange looked cautious. Tony threw you through a door? No, Peter did, Steve said. A glass one. This force just slammed into me. I've never felt anything like it. The power, Doctor Strange said wonderingly. The soul. I thought it was the residual effects of the stones, but, he stiffed. Scarlet Witch, your power comes from the Mind Stone, yes? Wanda, she corrected, and yes. The scepter. Then you need to come with me, he said, striding out of the room. Wanda looked uncertain and then rose to her feet and went after him. Steve paused for a moment, then deciding this was something he needed to see, he got up and followed, hearing the others fall into step behind him. Tony tapped his phone, leaned his head against the back of the chair he was slumped in, and said, Friday, show me the world. The whole world? She asked. I suspect that would be an overpowering amount of data to process. No, maybe not. Give me some news channels. I want to know what's going on out there. The hologram spread from his phone, and he saw news channels flickering across, displaying the turmoil that had overtaken the world since the return. It was not the kind of chaos he was expecting, riots and turmoil after what Steve had said, but it wasn't good. There was mass confusion, people standing in the streets looking lost, and walls of flyers already being created that displayed the names and previous addresses of those that had been left behind, trying to locate them. That was going to be a challenge, Tony knew. Many people had moved into new homes, no longer needing the extra space or being able to afford their rent or mortgages anymore with their breadwinners lost. Others had not been able to stay in homes steeped in memories of the gone. We've got to do something about that, Friday, he said. Build a database. Search social security records and start tracking new addresses. That is a consuming project, boss. It requires a massive amount of data flow. If Peter can save the world, you and me can bring them together again, he said, voice harsh. Start out with the US. We'll build from there and share the tech, but start now. Okay, boss. There was a pause. You have a call coming through from home. Tony rubbed a tired hand over his face, put it through. Pepper's face filled the hologram, tired and worried, but when she saw Tony, she visibly relaxed. Tony, she sighed. Tony forced a smile. Hey, Pep. How are you? Tony's eyes moved to Peter, color better now and heart steadier, but still weak and injured. Compared to him, he was great. I'm fine. You don't need to lie to me, she said. Tell me what's happening. Tony ran a rough hand through his hair. They had to operate on his hand, the burns, Pep, it's bad. But Cho is here now. But Rhodey says she brought what she needs to get to work, so I think you'll be okay soon. Is Rhodey with you? She asked, and Tony thought he could hear hope in her voice. No, he took off again. That wasn't technically true. Though Tony had not said the words, he knew he had managed to drive his friend away. It's just me and Pete now. How is he? Unconscious again, in pain, I think, but he was awake earlier and he was Peter. She smiled. That's good, but was that in doubt? In a way. Yeah. I can't really explain it. He wasn't sure he wanted to explain that strangely formal voice. I was worried before, he wasn't himself, but when he woke up, he was the kid. He sat up straighter, to improve his appearance of defeat and exhaustion. And he was so exhausted, and said, I'm not sure when I'm going to get home, Pep. She raised a hand. I know, Tony, you don't need to explain. Me and Morgan, we're gonna be okay. Stay with Peter and take care of him. I know that's where you need to be right now. Tony found himself smiling, though he thought he was beyond it for so long. Thanks, Pep. Can I talk to Morgan? Sure. She looked over her shoulder and called. Morgan, Daddy wants to talk to you. He heard the creak of the playroom door, the door he'd always planned to oil but never got around to it, and then racing footsteps. Pepper huffed out a breath as Morgan slammed down on her lap and waved. Hey, Daddy, you coming home soon? As soon as I can, Tony said, but Peter needs me right now. He expected sadness, disappointment, but she beamed and said, Peter, my brother? Can I talk to him? Tony felt a thrill in his chest to hear the word brother from his little girl in reference to Peter. Morgan had talked about Peter as long as she'd been able to talk, asking for stories about him at bedtime instead of fairy tales, and Tony had delivered as best he could, telling her all about Spider-Man. It was good to see her enthusiasm. He also liked to use the word because of the claim it gave him on the kid. Peter was family. It might not be that way from Peter's point of view, not yet, but Tony would make sure he knew how he felt about him, not leave him in doubt of it ever again. He's sleeping right now, Tony said. She shrugged. Okay. But tell him I want to when he's awake. I will, Tony promised. Be good and take care of your mom for me. Make sure you give Gerald lots of love. I'll call when I can. I'll be good, and I'll take care of Mama, but Gerald ate my shirt, so Mama said I have to keep away from the paddock when he's hungry. She wriggled off Pepper's lap. I'm gonna go play. Love you 3000, Tony said as she darted away. He heard footsteps coming closer, and then her face filled the screen again as she leaned close. You can't love me 3000 because that's mine. Tony smiled. Fine, you can love me that much, and I'll find a bigger number for you. She considered a moment and then said, okay, and disappeared. Pepper watched her go and waited for the creak of the door closing again, and then said, don't forget to take care of yourself, Tony. I know how you can get, but you need to be at your best to help Peter. Sleep, eat, breathe. Tony nodded. I will. I love you, Pep. She smiled. 3000? Tony pretended to think go that far, but maybe 2000. She waved a hand at him. You're an ass. You go take care of Peter, and I'll go take care of your other kid. I will, Tony said seriously. She stared at him a moment. I know you will. She touched her fingers to her lips and held them out to the phone. And then the call disconnected, and the hologram shrank back into his phone. Tony picked up Peter's hand and said, You hear that, Pete? That was my Morgan. I can't wait for you to meet her. As you probably heard, she's already pretty invested in you. He leaned close, willing Peter to say something to him, to twitch or respond, but there was nothing. He stroked his thumb over Peter's warm skin and said, That's okay. You get some rest. I'll be here when you wake up again. He settled back in his seat and then jerked upright again when the door slid open, and Strange and Wanda appeared, closely followed by Steve, Rhodey, Sam, Thor, and Bruce. Tony glowered at them. Not now, guys. We can't wait, Strange said curtly. Wanda, can you feel it? You're more connected than I was. Wanda looked puzzled but approached the bed. Tony jumped to his feet and leaned over Peter, saying, It's all good. You don't have to blast anyone away. They're all worthy. He was worried that there would be damage to the equipment helping Peter if his ability to knock people on their asses swiped them all into it. Peter had to have been listening as no one was thrown back, but Tony still raised his hand and growled, Keep your hands off of him. As Wanda placed a hand over Peter, running it from his head to his chest and then jerked away. Can you feel it? Strange asked. Pale and lips parted with a shocked breath, Wanda nodded and said, "Yes, it's there." Strange looked amazed, his eyes falling on Peter with wonder. "What?" Tony snapped. "What are you talking about?" "That boy," Wanda said quietly. "He has the Mind Stone." "No," Strange said. "He does not just have the Mind Stone. He has them all." His eyes fell on Peter's face, and his next words came as a form of benediction. "Peter Parker is the stones." Tony leaned back, distancing himself from the words as something finally clicked into place. Peter had said it himself, explained why the stones had not killed him as they should. "Damn," he whispered, his hand falling on Peter's chest to both steady himself and to give comfort. He was worthy. "Worthy," Steve said slowly. "He was worthy." He'd heard the kid saying it, in that strange stilted tone, yes, but he'd heard it. He'd agreed with it, known the kid had been worthy as he saved them all, but he'd not understood the breadth and depth of the word, what it meant. There were gasps around them, and Steve felt the tension of the room ratchet up. He looked around to take in the faces of his friends. Wanda's eyes were wet, and she was watching Peter with a pained look. Rhodey looked smug, as if the awe Tony was showing was feeding his feelings for the man and kid, confirming what he'd said before. Bruce looked amazed, and Steve thought he was perhaps comparing his own experience with the stones. He had felt the sheer power of them and been wounded by them. Thor was staring at the kid with intensity, his fisted hand slightly raised as if he was feeling the weight on an immense hammer in his hand. Mjolnir, which could only be wielded if you are worthy. Steve had been amazed that he was worthy enough to wield it on the battlefield, but that seemed insignificant when he compared it to being worthy of bearing the Infinity Stones and living. And more, to not only bear them but to become one with them. His eyes found Sam, and he saw that he looked wary. Steve assumed he was weighing what he felt and seen in the kid, when he'd saved them, with the unknown reality of that kind of power. And Steve himself, he was torn between awe and worry. He couldn't wrap his mind around the idea of the kid being the stones. He didn't even know fully what it meant. Doctor Strange's words seemed to indicate that the kid was somehow bearing the stones, but were they in him somehow, or was Peter the embodiment of them now? The high-speed chatter of the kid replaced with that somber tone as he said, "Worthy?" "Okay, I'll ask," Sam said. "What does that mean? What kind of threat are we looking at here?" Tony seemed to snap out of his odd appraisal of the kid, and he pointed a finger at Sam. "Threat?" he snarled. "You think Peter is a threat?" "Easy, Tone," Rhodey said. "This is just a shock. Sam doesn't mean anything bad." Tony's hands fisted and he took a step towards Sam, face filled with fury, and Steve stepped between them. "Calm down, Tony," he said. "Think about what Peter is capable of when you get upset. If he starts throwing this around in here, he might be hurt." Tony pressed a fisted hand to his chest, closed his eyes, and took 2 deep breaths through his nose. "Yes. You're right." He opened his eyes again and said in a measured voice, "Out. All of you." "We need to talk," Steve objected. "We will," he said, his tone making the words a threat. "But not here. The kid can hear us, so I'm not going to have him lying there, scared and in pain, while you all talk crap about him." He pointed at the door. "Out." Rhodey was first out, tugging Sam behind him, and the rest followed. Steve watched Tony as he bent close to the kid, whispered something, and patted his cheek, and then roughly gestured Steve out of the room, then followed. They went through the halls to the seating area where Steve had waited for the others before, and he took a seat, wanting the others to do the same to create less of an atmosphere of tension in the room so they could talk. The others followed his lead, leaving only Strange and Thor stood apart little away from them, and Tony and Rhodey standing, arms identically crossed, a united front. "Strange," Tony said in a tone of forced calm. "What does this mean for Peter?" "I don't know," Dr. Strange replied. "I didn't even know it was possible. The outcomes to the battle I saw, of the millions, there was one victory for our side, and that was at the cost of your life when you harnessed the stones to destroy the enemy. You won for us." Tony reacted to the fact he was supposed to die without a flicker of his carefully controlled expression, but something changed in his eyes. "You didn't see Peter doing it?" he asked. "No, it wasn't shown as even a possibility. I didn't see anything involving him and Gauntlet other than that he was shown carrying it on various iterations of the battlefield. What he did was impossible. What he is now is impossible. He shouldn't have been capable of it. Only Dr. Banner was able. through great force of mind at a high price to his body, to use them once because of his unique physiology. Very well, Thor said, now crossing his own arms. The child is impossible, a hero, and I accept that. But what is capable of now? If Thanos could wipe out half the universe with one snap, what happens if the child gets upset and throws a tantrum? Tony took a step forwards, and Rhodey laid a hand on his arm. Tony stopped and took a breath, but his furious gaze was on Thor as he said, "Watch what you say, Asgard." It was the dismissal of Thor's name that alerted Steve to the very real emotions raging through Tony. "It is a concern for us all, Tony," Steve said, keeping his voice calm. "We are not denying that Peter is a hero. I will be forever grateful for what he did for us all and everyone we care about, but he is an unknown quantity now. We need to know what he is capable of if we're going to manage him." "He doesn't need to be managed," Tony growled. Rhodey sighed and said, "Just take a breath, Tone." When Tony obeyed, he went on. "How about we all come at this as if we're talking about a 16-year-old kid that just saved the world and not a rogue nuke we're playing catch with? We all have questions and concerns, but Tony knows Peter better than any of us, so he can tell you what you need to know if you give him a chance. Tony, tell them who Peter is." Tony frowned. "He's Peter. Spider-Man, the kid that just saved us all. What else do you need to know?" Rhodey held up a hand. "None of us know him apart from what we've seen, and that's not a lot. Do you think he's a threat?" "No," Tony said without hesitation. "He would never knowingly hurt anyone." "What about unintentionally?" Steve asked pragmatically. Tony seemed on the point of answering sharply, then he stopped and said, "He tries to do the right thing, always." Thor gave a curt nod, and Steve felt something drop into his stomach. He would have liked a reassurance that the kid was safe, but Tony, who Rhodey said loved him, couldn't make those guarantees. Though Steve probably wouldn't have been able to trust Tony's judgment alone anyway. He'd learned from personal experience that love blinded you. Tony had almost died because Steve's love for Bucky had blinded him. Tony pressed his fingertips to his temples. "He's a good kid, the best of all of us. He wanted to be one of us, an Avenger, before. He pushed for it so hard." He gave a small laugh and shook his head, seemingly lost in a memory. "But when the choice came, when he had his chance, he chose not to. He wanted to protect the little guy instead. That's what he does. He swings around Queens doing his thing, helping people, protecting his neighborhood. He could use the power he was given for his own ends but doesn't. Hell, he won't play football, even though I know he wants to, because he doesn't think it's fair to take the advantages that came with Spider-Man for his own gain." Really, his hands dropped to his sides, and he looked on the verge of tears. "He's a good kid." Rhodey squeezed his shoulder. "We need to know more about this thing, I agree, but we don't do that by treating the kid like a threat. He's unconscious right now, and when he wakes, we'll talk to him about it." "No," Tony said, voice close to a shout. "We don't tell him about any of this." "Tony, we have no choice," Steve said. "He needs to know the power he possesses if he's going to be on guard for it, to learn how to control it." Tony shook his head curtly. "No, he's too young. He struggled for words. "He's just Peter. We all, every one of us apart from Bruce, chose the power we have. We joined the fight as adults, knowing what it meant and what we could lose. Even Bruce, who had no choice in the Hulk, was old enough and wise enough to know what he was used that power. Peter doesn't want it. He chose not to join us. He was on that battlefield because I was too stupid to keep him off of it, and he did something amazing, but he didn't know what he was getting into. He couldn't. No 16-year-old is capable of understanding those kinds of choices or risks. He didn't even choose the power that made him Spider-Man. He was bitten by a damn irradiated spider. It was an accident." "You can't have it both ways, Tony," Sam said quietly. "He's either old enough and wise enough to control this power, or he's too young and immature for it." Tony glared at him, and Steve thought he might start throwing punches soon. "Think, Tony," Steve said. "He threw Thor back 12 feet. He shoved me through a door. If he did that to someone vulnerable, he could kill them." Something glinted in Tony's eyes. He was doing that to protect himself. When Thor got blasted, he was swinging his hammer. When you were knocked on your ass, we were fighting. Stay away from him, and no one will be hurt. When they were treating him, he stopped them a couple times, held them back a little, he wouldn't let them draw blood, but he didn't hurt them. And once I got through to him, told him it was safe, he was fine. He was in pain when they were working on his hand, but he didn't stop them because I was there. You think if you're close to him and he feels safe, he'll be controlled, Steve said, mulling over the idea. It did make sense. Tony had been yelling about how he'd almost killed him when Peter had thrown Steve through the door. Peter would have been scared. And if he felt the same way about Tony that Tony felt about him, he'd be desperate to protect Tony, too. I do, Tony said with a curt nod. And I am the one that gets to decide here. Peter is on me. I brought him into the fight, he's my kid, so he's my responsibility. His parents are dead, his aunt died a couple years ago, so I'm all he's got left. I get to choose what he knows and when. Understand? He crossed his arms over his chest, eyes darting from face to face, daring them to argue. Rhodey looked oddly satisfied as he watched his friend, and he was the first to speak up. I'm with you, Tone. Peter's your kid, so you get to call the shots. The rest of us will keep our distance unless you or Peter want us there. And I won't tell him anything you don't think he should know. Wanda rubbed her hands over her face and said, I agree. I think we all owe Peter too much to make these choices for him. And you're right. I chose my power, and so did Pietro. His power and nature killed him when he chose to sacrifice himself to save Clint. Peter would have done the same for us. I will say nothing. She looked at Tony, and there was something strange in her eyes. But I would like to speak to him when he's awake. Tony stared at her for a moment, seeming to be searching for something in her face, perhaps a lie. Tony had always been a little guarded with Wanda after she manipulated his mind, driving that fear into him, which ended with Ultron's creation. They were a team, but Tony didn't trust easily and didn't forget. He looked pleased by her support, though, and said, I'll see how he feels about that. She nodded and settled back in her seat, eyes cast down to her hands folded in her lap. I'm with you, too, Bucky said, catching Steve off guard, and, judging by the expressions of everyone else, them all, too. I enlisted knowing it might end with my death. Everything that followed, what I did and became, was because I made that first choice. Peter didn't choose his power, none of it, and he saved us. He seemed to force himself to look at Tony, accepting the venomous eyes that met his. You get to call the shots. But I would like to speak to him, too. No chance in hell, Tony snarled. Bucky nodded, obviously having expected the answer. Fair enough, but just make sure he knows. Make sure to tell him there are people who understand what it's like to be burdened. It's the least I can do. He did save us, after all. Tony narrowed his eyes at Bucky, almost as if he hoped he could burn him with his gaze the way he would with the weapons in his suit, and said, Stay away from my kid, Barnes. Steve held in a sigh. He understood Tony's feelings for Bucky, but Bucky had taken a step, offered help, and Tony had thrown it back in his face. Bucky had not been in control when he killed Howard and Maria Stark. It had been the Winter Soldier's crime, not Steve's best friend's. He wanted to defend him, but to bring that subject further to the forefront of what was already a very tense situation was a bad idea. Bucky nodded and bowed his head. What about you, Banner? Tony asked with a frown. Steve waited anxiously for the answer, too. He didn't know which side Bruce would take in this situation. He knew the power of the stones as he'd wielded them, and he knew the danger of power as he'd lived years trying to beat back the Hulk. But through that, he knew burdens and could perhaps relate to the kid's situation. He seemed to consider for a long time before he nodded and said, I'll leave it to you to decide what and when to tell him, but I will say he needs to know soon. If these stones give him anywhere near the kind of power I had with the Hulk in the beginning, he needs to be warned. Look how long it took me to get the control I have now. He needs to know about it. I'm not pushing to talk to him yet, but if and when he needs me, I'll be there to help. Strange? Tony prompted. Dr. Strange was silent a long time, and then he said, The kid is an unknown factor to us all, and I plan to fix that. I won't tell him anything, nor do I wish to talk to him until I know more. He is your responsibility, Mr. Stark, so I suggest you take that seriously. I'll go back to the sanctum to see what I can find. I'll be back when I have actual information for us to work with. Without another word, he stood and swirled his hands in the flowing movements that created the orange portal. Before Steve could say anything, he had stepped through it and disappeared. What about you, Steve? Bucky asked, drawing Steve's eyes to him. Where do you stand? Bucky was sitting forward in his seat, hands hanging between his knees and eyebrow raised. Though his face was carefully neutral, Steve felt the tension of the question. Steve thought Bucky was waiting to see if he'd side with him, protect the kid, or protect them all from the possible threat. Steve had to consider his answer carefully before speaking. He was torn. They all made good points about the kid, the goodness of him, the heroism, compared to the potential risk. And Steve had to weigh them each up and find the right words. He at least knew some of what he was getting into when Erskine gave him the serum. He knew he would be enhanced, and he'd been eager for it. Tony was right. He'd chosen his power. Peter had not done that with any of it. All he had done was choose what to do with the power he had, and it sounded like he'd made good choices. But the stones were unknown. The potential risk was high. Ultimately, he decided to put his trust in Tony and be careful to monitor the situation as it unfolded. He would be ready to act if necessary, but he would not allow a child to be hurt again under his watch without doing everything he could to find another way first. "I won't say anything to him," he said. "I will leave that to you, Tony, but I suggest you tell him yourself soon. However, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he already knows. The stones are unlikely to settle in him and not make their presence known. He might already be aware of them." Tony looked stricken. His lips parted and eyes widened. Steve realized that he'd never considered the possibility. His concern had been protecting the kid he loved. "And," Steve went on, "the person that wakes might not be the one you expect. We heard his voice when he was unconscious, and that did not sound like the kid as we've heard him before. I think you need to prepare yourself for a very different version of Peter when he wakes." Awkward fear from Tony, but he smiled smugly and said, "No, I've already seen the real Peter. He woke up for a few minutes earlier, and it was the kid I know talking. He's fine." His face became wary again, and he turned his eyes on Sam and said, "What about you?" Sam pressed his fingertips to his temples and said, "The team has spoken. I'll go with it." Steve shook his head. "No, this isn't about the team, Sam. This is different from anything we've ever faced before. We all need to be doing it for ourselves off our own backs. The world needs us to be united right now, but for this fight." "There will be no fight," Tony growled. Steve kept his eyes on Sam, but it was a shout from Thor that made him flinch. "No fight? Do none of you remember what happened on that battlefield before the snap? We had a chance. I had a chance to end it. If I had not been weak-willed, if I had killed Thanos when I had the chance, the universe would have been saved 5 years of suffering. I will not be weak again. This threat cannot stand. We have to go for the head." Tony stared at him, lips parted with shock, and Thor stared back at him, brows down and eyes stony. "You will not touch my kid, Asgard," Tony snarled. Thor took a step forward, and everyone jumped to their feet, stepping between them. To Steve's astonishment, they all, Sam included, placed themselves in front of Tony. Thor stood alone against them all. Wanda's hands were raised as if about to create an energy blast. Bruce, the biggest threat, stood directly in front of Thor, hands fisted. Even Steve was on Tony's side, against Thor, who was his friend, without thought. He knew it was the right place to be, though. He understood Thor's fear, and he knew he held massive regret for what he had done and failed to do when he'd had his chance, but a kid would not die for it. Not unless there was no other choice. Thor looked from face to face and shook his head. "You will not stop me doing the right thing." "No," a voice said from the doorway. "But I will. You will not create violence here." All eyes snapped to T'Challa, who was walking into the room, except Tony's, whose focus remained on Thor. "I have heard what you have said," T'Challa went on. "I know what is happening and the decisions you are wrangling with. You are all overlooking a fact, though. Wakanda is not your place to decide anything. While Peter Parker is here, he is under our protection and will not be harmed." Thor looked furious. This risk the child poses is. What he possesses is great, yes, T'Challa agreed. "I see it. But I also know that every life here is in his debt. Until there is proven reason for other actions, he will be protected." He smirked. "However, from what I have heard, the boy is capable of protecting himself." Thor looked from T'Challa to Steve, then his eyes moved from each face of his friends, and he nodded. "Very well. You can all protect this threat instead of doing what we are all beholden to do, which is protect against things like him." Tony seemed to be shaking, he was so angry, and Rhodey had his hand pressed against Tony's chest as if preparing to hold him back. "I won't let you touch my son," Tony snarled. Thor stared at him and then cut a hand through the air. "Fine. But this is where it ends." He fixed his gaze on Steve. "You can use this united front you have created without me. You will not see me again." He turned and marched out. No one moved or even seemed to breathe freely until he appeared outside and went into the Quinjet. He stepped out again with Mjolnir in his hand. He spun it, Steve's eyes watching its progress, and then threw it into the air and was pulled away with it. Sam whistled between his teeth. "Damn, that's one pissed off god." "He's gone," Rhodey said, his tone soothing. "Look, Tone, he's gone." Tony nodded curtly and said, "He'll come back. Not while Peter is here," T'Challa said. "When you take him outside our borders, his protection will be on his own shoulders. I believe he is more than capable of bearing it with the help of the stones." "Do you know more than us?" Steve asked cautiously. He was surprised T'Challa was stepping up to protect Peter. T'Challa shook his head. "No, I think I perhaps know less even, but we all owe him a debt, and I will not forget that. Though the stones are incredibly powerful, this we know, they are not evil. They have been used for evil. I believe, and some of my people disagree, that this is not an opening for an end but a new dawn. The stones have power, and from what you have said, Tony, the child has strength. I believe that this could be something great for us all." Without another word, he turned and walked away. Tony let out a huge breath and pressed his hand to his chest as if to calm a racing heart. "Damn," Sam whispered. "Hands up if your head is spinning, too." Without thought, Steve raised his hand and saw that everyone else had done the same. "I guess there's no point me saying it now," Sam said. "But I'm with you, Tony. I'll say nothing to Peter, and I'll be there if I'm needed. You know what I do, and we all heard that scream on the battlefield from him. If he needs to talk through that or anything else, let me know." "Thank you," Tony said quietly. "I've got to." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I'm going back to Peter." "I'll come with you," Rhodey said. Tony hesitated a moment and then nodded, and they walked together back towards Peter's room. "I'll go see if Helen needs me," Bruce said. Sam murmured something about food, and Wanda nodded, and they left, leaving Bucky and Steve alone. "Do you think Thor will come back?" Bucky asked. "I don't know. I hope not. I don't think he is a risk to Peter, not with the stones, but I don't want to see either of them hurt." "And do you think T'Challa could be right? This could be a good thing for all of us?" Steve sighed. "Honestly, Buck, I don't know. I didn't even think of it like that. If Tony is right about the kid, that he's as good as he believes, then I think we've got a chance of it being very good. God knows we need it. The world is in chaos right now. We've all got to start over." Bucky nodded. "I know. You going to be a part of it?" Steve asked cautiously. Bucky considered a long time before answering, and when he did, it was not the one Steve had been expecting, though it was one that created warmth in his chest. "Yeah, I am. I think it's time I stopped hiding." He smiled slightly. "I figure you could use a wingman." Steve clapped him on the shoulder and squeezed it. "I don't think I've ever needed one more, Buck." Everything was in pieces now, the world and his friends' lives, and he was much happier knowing he had Bucky on his side. That and the idea T'Challa was right, that this was a good thing, was what was keeping him going. Peter had roused to the sound of voices, and he'd been okay, though his hand had burned. Then Doctor Strange had said the words that made his mind spin out of control. He does not just have the Mind Stone. He has them all. Peter Parker is the stones. He'd been struggling to wake, to ask his questions. Then there had been a voice in his mind once again, saying, "Take him, space," and he'd been rising up and out of his body. He had a moment to back and see a perfect copy of himself lying on the bed, pale and grubby from battle, injured hand still encased, before he'd been dragged along in Tony's wake to where the Avengers gathered to discuss him, to the place his world fell apart all over again, and he learned just what he was now. A threat. He stood, an unseen observer to the conversation centered around him, and felt his world being torn apart. "I won't let you touch my son," Tony snarled. Even through the shock and horror Peter was feeling, his heart skipped a beat at the word. Tony called him son. "I told you there is a soul bond there." "Yeah, sure, but," Peter's voice broke. "Please, can you make it stop now? I've seen enough. You need to see it all. Through his love, Tony Stark will not tell you the truth, but you need to know it, and we did not believe you would accept it from us. You're something great, worthy." Peter's denial was lost as Thor spoke again. "Fine. But this is where it ends." He fixed his gaze on Captain America. You can use this united front you have created without me. You will not see me again." Peter felt an ache in his chest. He was doing this, destroying the Avengers. He didn't mean to, and he wanted to fix it, but he didn't know how. He'd been trying to do the right thing when he'd put on the gauntlet, and in a way, it had been right. He saved Mr. Stark, but now this. "Please, make it stop." There was a pause, and then the voice said, "We believe you have seen everything of importance. Space will take you back." Peter felt himself being pulled back into his body, his eyes flying open and then filling with tears that were nothing to do with the renewed burning pain in his hand. He felt bereft of everything he thought he knew about himself. Peter Parker, Spider-Man, the wannabe Avenger, had been enough to handle, but he wasn't any of those things anymore. He was something new and dangerous. "Not dangerous. We are not evil, and you are worthy." "Stop saying that," Peter said aloud. "I don't want to hear it. It's all you. It's all wrong now. I'm a threat." "You are a threat in one being's eyes. Did you not see how many stood for you? They will know the truth." "But I hurt people. I threw Thor around," they said it. "To defend yourself. That is not a danger. That is instinct. You will learn to control it, to harness us for good." Peter put his uninjured hand over his face and sobbed into it. "Only time has ever been used for good before, but that's what we want to do. We chose you as you were worthy. You will fulfill our true and longed for purpose. We want to help. Can't you just go? Can I cut you out or something? Please, I can't do this. We are no longer physical objects that can be picked up and put down. We're not a part of you." "But if I die?" Peter asked hopefully. The voice sounded almost sad as it answered. "That is no longer a choice for you. We will protect." Hot tears spilled down his cheeks, and his chest shuddered with sobs. He didn't want this. He was scared of it. And there was nothing he could do about it. Peter was trapped. "A threat. It's a good look on you, you know?" Rhodey said as they walked back towards Peter's room. Tony frowned. "What is being a father?" "I've been a father for 4 years, Rhodey." In his heart, it was longer than that. He'd had a year loving Peter as a son, though he'd not been able to be a real father as he'd not dared show Peter how he felt, hadn't even let himself see it truly. It was only after he was gone that he realized what he'd had and lost. Morgan was the one that set that side of himself free. "I think you've been a dad a lot longer than that." Rhodey smiled slightly. "You remember the day I came to the house after Morgan was born? What happened when I asked to hold her?" Tony felt color creep up his cheeks. "I know what you're going to say, but she'd been fussy all morning, and Pep had just fed her. I didn't want her sicking up all over your nice shirt. I was helping you out by hanging onto her." 2 hours, Tony. It took 2 hours for Pepper to persuade you to hand her over, and even then, it was like it was killing you to do it. I get it. I didn't before. I didn't understand what you had with Peter, even though I saw what it did to you when you lost him. I see it now, though. You'd already lost one kid, so you were going to hold on to the other damn tight. Tony sighed, and they turned a corner. "Yeah, I know. What's with the face? In case you didn't notice, we just dodged a very large bullet in the form of the God of Thunder throwing a tantrum. He's gone, and T'Challa has Peter under his protection here. I don't think Thor will be back. I think once he's settled and thought it through, maybe downed a few barrels of ale, he'll see the right in what we were saying. We dodged, I know we did, but that doesn't cancel out the rest of what's going on. Peter has all this power, and I know he's not a threat, he can handle it, but Steve was right. He will find out. How is a 16-year-old boy supposed to handle that kind of news? Honestly, I don't know, since you never gave me a chance to know him." "I was protecting him," Tony said defensively. "He wanted the whole secret identity thing, and with the Accords." Rhodey grabbed his arm and stopped him. Tony stared into his friend's eyes and saw the innate calm he always carried in the toughest times. "I know what you were doing, and I'd have done the same, but you can't anymore. We're on your side with this, in case his stepping in front of Thor didn't tell you that, and we all want to help Peter. We all owe him." He frowned. "For me, it's more than that. I do owe the kid, but you kinda talked him up back there, and I want to get to know him properly, as more than the sassy masked crusader who helped take down a 65-foot Ant-Man while referring to Empire as a really old movie." He shook his head and laughed. "What I'm saying, Tone, is don't be selfish with this, because it's ultimately going to hurt your son. He's going to need more help than just you can give." He paused and said, "And I think Barnes might be a good person to give it." Fury flooded through Tony's veins. "No way in hell," Tony growled, marching away. Rhodey hurried after him. "I know how you feel, and I get it, but it wasn't Barnes that killed your parents. It was the Winter Soldier, and he's gone. If you think I'm leaving my son to the care of that," he sputtered, unable to find words, and then cut his hand through the air. "No. You've got it backward, you know. It's not Barnes you're mad at, not deep down, it's... He killed my family, Rhodey. You want to see the footage? See what he did to my mom? Because I can have Friday track it down for you. Then you'll see." Rhodey placed a hand on his chest. "Deep down, it's Steve you're mad at, still, but you don't want to be. You don't want to feel betrayed by one of your best friends, so you're laying it all on Barnes because that's easier." Tony brushed his hand away and strode towards Peter's room. Before he could reach it, though, he heard harrowing sobs that tore at his heart and made him break into a run. "Peter." It sounded like more than physical pain was causing the sounds. It was more like Peter's heart was breaking. Tony was sprinting when he reached the doorway and slammed into the invisible barrier that sent him reeling back and his hand flying to his nose. It wasn't bleeding as he'd expected, but it throbbed with pain. Dismissing his discomfort, he moved back to the barrier and pressed his hand against it. Peter was curled on his side, his wounded hand still encased in with the way it was moving with each sob that tore from the kid's chest. Tony thought it had to be touching the sides and hurting him. "Peter, let me in," he said. "What's going on?" Rhodey asked, coming to a stop beside him and placing a hand on the barrier. "What happened to him?" "I don't know," Tony snapped. "Pete, kid, I'm here. Let me in." Peter gave his head a small shake, and another sob ripped from him. "Peter, let me in," he said, forcing the quaver out of his voice to sound firm, "right now." He wanted to be gentle, to comfort the kid, but that was impossible if he couldn't get near him, so he had to come at it from a different angle. He'd only ever needed to be tough on him once, after that whole ferry debacle, and that had wrecked the kid. Peter was already wrecked, though, and he couldn't make it worse. When the barrier failed to fall, he made his voice a shout, drawing Dr. Wikibi and 2 nurses into the hall, all looking worried. "Let me in, Parker." He felt the wall in front of him fall, and he rushed into the room. "Easy, Pete," he said softly, bending over the bed and easing him out of his curled ball onto his back, careful to steadying his shoulders so his injured hand didn't move too much. "I'm here." In response, Peter sobbed and turned his face away. Tony had been too self-conscious before, when Peter woke, to hold his hand, to overstep the boundaries he'd created in their relationship. But he felt no hesitation now as he sat on the edge of the bed and gently turned Peter's face to his, thumb stroking his cheek. "What's wrong, kid?" he asked. "Is it the pain?" Peter's streaming eyes fixed on him for a moment, and there was a look of pure anguish in them with their strange rainbow colors, and then he squeezed them closed and said, "I messed it all up. And I can't stop it," he said. He drew a shaking breath. "I can't even die to make it go away." Tony's heart stuttered to a stop and then kicked into a pace faster than he'd ever felt in his life. "Die? No, you're not dying. Why would you even think that? You're going to be fine. If you drop the hold on the others, they'll be able to get you some more painkillers." He smoothed back Peter's hair. "We can fix this." Peter shook his head, a strangled cry breaking from him. "I heard it. I know what I am. I know I need to die." Tony's breath stopped, and his eyes widened as an icepick of pain pierced his chest. Peter's hearing was great, but Tony had made sure they were way out of his range to hear before they'd spoken. He couldn't know what was said. "Why do you need to die?" he asked cautiously. "Because of the stones." Thor was right. "I'm a threat. And I can't do this. It's too much for me. I'm just Peter." He said that they want to do good, but, he choked in a breath. "I wanted to do good on the ferry, and I messed it up. I'll mess it up again, I know. It's too much. If the stones can wipe out all those people, what will they do if I've got them? I can't control it, Mr. Stark." Tony felt tears burning in his eyes, and he willed them back, failing as one fell down his cheek, exposing his pain to the kid. "You won't hurt anyone, Peter. If you heard what was said back there, did you hear what I said? What T'Challa said? He said I'm protected, but I can't be, I shouldn't be." Tony cupped his face in his hands, thumbs stroking his cheeks, wiping away the tears. "You didn't hear it all then. T'Challa thinks this could be something great for us all. You could be great. He's not talking about Wakanda or the Avengers. He's talking about the world. Pete, you've already saved it once. You did that because you're worthy. Sure, it's a lot to handle, I know, but I don't trust anyone else in the world to handle this power more than I trust you." Peter's eyes opened, and he stared up at him, lips parted and breaths coming in weak pants. "What if I go wrong again, like the fairy?" Tony leaned closer. "You went wrong then because you were trying to handle something too big for you without help. That's on me. I should have paid attention to what you were saying instead of just telling you to leave it to me. Because I didn't take care of it properly. If I'd been there, none of that would have happened. This, the stones, you, all of it, is going to be you and me together. I won't leave you alone to deal with it." Peter stared up at him, the fear in his face slowly being replaced by something new. Something Tony didn't recognize at first because it was so out of place the longed for. "You trust me?" he asked, confirming what he thought he was seeing. Peter nodded. "Yes." Tony lowered his forehead to Peter's and felt the kid's quick breaths against his face. "I got you on this, kid," he said. "I promise you won't be alone. I'll take care of you." He straightened up. "We'll fix it." "Mind says I can't get them out," Peter whispered. "Mind says?" A horrible thought occurred to him. "They're talking to you?" Peter nodded. "It's just mine so far, but he says I have to talk to them all to learn. Space took me to watch what you were saying because they didn't think you'd tell me." He stopped a moment as if listening to something else and then said, "And he says they are not something you can fix with your inventions or technology." Tony forced a smile, though he was horrified that the stones were actually communicating with Peter, the power and burden of them. "Then I'll not use technology. I'll use you. These things are in you. The best possible person in the world to bear them, so we'll find a way to help you with them." "I'm only a kid, Mr. Stark," he whispered. Tony shook his head curtly. "No, you were a kid until you stepped onto Titan with me. Then you became an Avenger. Then you put on that gauntlet and became something else." He locked eyes with Peter. "You became a whole new kind of hero, nothing the world has ever seen before. That gauntlet would have killed any other person that did what you did, but you lived because you were worthy." Peter's lip trembled. "I don't want to be worthy." Tony wiped away the tear that slipped down Peter's cheek and then the one that fell down his own, the proof of shared pain, and said, "I don't think you get a choice in it, kid. You just are. And remember what you told me that time, when you were hopped up on the sugar from the giant raspberry slushy you persuaded Happy to stop for before you got to the compound?" Peter frowned. "Which time?" Tony chuckled. "Good point. After the whole Coney Island thing, he pretty much spoiled you, didn't he? The time I'm thinking about is something your uncle said to you." He paused and tried to find the words Peter had spoken and failed. Something about power. Peter's eyes widened. "Yeah," he said, "with great power comes great responsibility." Tony nodded and smiled. "Exactly. And you've got great power that I know you don't want, but if you focus on how to manage that, I'll be in charge of responsibility for a while. That okay?" Peter's lips tugged into a smile. "You won't let me hurt anyone?" "I swear it," Tony said seriously. "You and me, kid, we're in this together." "What about Morgan and Miss Potts?" Peter asked. "You heard me talking about them, huh? I wondered how much you were hearing." "I heard some, and Mind explained about Morgan." He smiled slightly. "You got a kid now. You can't take care of them if you're taking care of me." He bit his lip. "And I don't think I should be near them." Tony sighed. "They'll understand if I need to stay with you until you've got your feet under you." Peter shook his head jerkily. "No, I'm not taking you away from them." Tony sighed, torn between his two needs. He wanted to be with Peter, to help him through this, but he couldn't abandon the rest of his family to do it. Pepper would understand, but Morgan was too young, and Peter would never accept it. "Then I'll bring in reinforcements," he said. "Can you drop the barrier or whatever you're using to hold everyone back?" Peter nodded, and Tony looked over his shoulder to see Rhodey lurking just outside the door. At Tony's gesture, Rhodey C. stopped at the end of the bed. "Peter, meet James Rhodes," Tony said. "He's my oldest friend, and he's almost as wise as you." "Hey, Peter," Rhodey said, his lips spread in a wide smile. "It's good to meet you, properly, at last." Peter gave him a small embarrassed wave and said, "Hey, Mr. Rhodes." "Rhodey," he corrected. Tony laughed softly. "That's something you're going to have to work on. It's technically been 6 years, and he still calls me Mr. Stark." Rhodey chuckled. "Yeah, we'll soon fix that." Me and Pete are going to have all the time in the world to get to know each other." He came deeper into the room and flopped onto the chair Tony usually sat in. "Tell me about yourself, kid. I know you're pretty handy in a fight, impressive with webs. And you can save the world on a good day, but what else do you like?" Peter shrugged, still looking a little anxious. Science. And I watch a lot of movies with my best friend, Ned. We like the old ones best." Rhodey leaned forwards and held up a hand. "I'm going to stop you there since you already trashed once me saying Empire was a really old movie. There's a difference between old and classic. If I went to see a movie in the cinema when it was released, it's not allowed to be called old, understand?" Peter gave a weak chuckle and said, "Okay." Rhodey clapped his hands and said, "Great. Now tell me about those web things." Peter smiled slightly and said, "It's not technically webs. It's something I came up with in the chem class. They're basically a mix of carbon proteins that have hierarchically arranged fibers that are interconnected in a way where friction." Rhodey's eyes widened, and Tony laughed. His friend was clearly impressed, and it gave him a strange warmth in his chest. He felt very much like a proud father in that moment. Tony watched Peter as he toyed with the blanket covering his legs. He was anxious, Tony could tell, and though there were so many things to be anxious about, he had a feeling this was something different to his breakdown an hour before. He raised his eyes and nodded to Rhodey, who was sitting on the other side of the bed, and said, "You think you can go root out some coffee for us, Rhodey?" Rhodey looked from Peter to Tony, and a moment of unspoken communication passed between them. "Coffee. Definitely. Hate to say it, Tone, but you look like crap." Peter gave a small laugh and looked up. "You do, Mr. Stark. Have you got any sleep, apart from when you were snoring up a storm in the chair?" Tony formed his face into mock anger and pointed a finger at him. "First of all, I don't snore. I'm a very quiet sleeper. Pepper says so." Rhodey snorted. "Since I have shared a dorm room with you, I can promise she's lying. You sound like a freight train when you get going." Tony shot him a glare and looked back to Peter, "And second, we're going to have to do something about this Mr. Stark thing." He rubbed his chin. "Got it? For every time you failed to call me Tony, I'll cut a day off your lab allowance." Peter's face fell. But Tony crossed his arms over his chest. "No buts. It's a fair deal. Every time you call me Mr. Stark, I get a new gray hair, and my father rolls in his grave. To save me from the barber's dye and my father a sprained back, you have to call me Tony." Peter stared at him for a moment and then nodded. "Sure." "Sure, what?" Tony asked. Peter bit his lip. "Sure, Tony." Tony grinned and sat back in his seat. "I feel better already. Now, Rhodey, coffee, go." Rhodey got to his feet and said, "You want anything, Peter?" Peter shook his head. "No, I'm fine. Probably not a good idea anyway," Tony said. "They've not given the okay for anything but the IV stuff so far, so we'll wait for the go-ahead." Rhodey nodded and left the room. Peter watched him go, and then his eyes fell to the blanket his fingers were picking at again. "You in pain?" Tony asked. Peter shrugged one shoulder. "It's okay. Better than it was. I don't want more painkillers." "They don't feel good." Tony was surprised as he'd been in some pretty bad pain in his life, and he'd always been grateful for the chemical assistance, even with the misspent college years' mistakes connotations they carried. Peter shook his head. "No, they're okay." Tony thought there was more to it, but he wanted to press his theory that there was something more going on with Peter. "What's going in that super-speed processing head of yours?" Peter took a small breath and then said, "I heard you say May died. What happened?" Tony sighed and leaned forward, plucking Peter's hand away from the now fraying blanket and holding it between his own. "It was a car accident. She was on her way to work. It was fast, she didn't suffer. It happened a couple years ago." Peter looked away, and Tony saw a tear slip down his cheek. "Her funeral, who did it? She had no one left after I was gone. I took care of it with her friends from the hospital. They arranged it all, made it what she'd have wanted, and I took care of the bills." "Did you go?" Peter asked. "Yes, I was there. I wasn't the only one. She had a lot of friends. I've seen too many funerals in my life, and May's was one of the ones that really showed me how much a person could be loved. I think it was everything you could have wanted for her, Pete." Peter pulled his hand away and wiped at his face and then looked back to Tony, the whites of his eyes around the rainbow irises red. "Thanks." Tony squeezed his hand. She was buried beside your uncle. I can take you there. Yeah, but maybe not yet. Surprised, as Tony knew how much Peter had loved his aunt, he nodded his agreement and said, "We'll need to get your hand taken care of first, obviously. That should be soon." Peter's gaze moved down to it, and he said, "Yeah, it's pretty gross." Tony leaned back in his seat and said, "Yeah, saving the world comes at a cost. Saving a city does, too. Ask me about the wormhole one day." Peter nodded and said, "Yeah, I remember watching that on the news with Uncle Ben. He said you were the bravest man he'd ever." His eyes became distant, and his head tilted to the side. "Pete," Tony said, getting to his feet and turning Peter's face to him. "You hearing me, kid?" Peter continued to look blank, and Tony's worry ratcheted up. He had seen this look before, after Rhodey's fall, when he would lose himself in the memory. Sometimes, the distant look would end with a sucked-in breath and hand to the chest to calm his racing heart. Tony hated the idea that Peter was going through anything like that now. "Peter, you're okay," he said, pushing back the kid's hair and rubbing his fingers over his scalp in hopes of soothing him. "I'm here, and you're fine." Peter snapped back to the room, with a gasp and racing heart displayed on the monitor. "You with me, kid?" Tony asked. Peter nodded, though when his eyes fixed on Tony's, it made him feel like he was being X-rayed by those rainbow irises. "I didn't know," he said. "Wow." "Didn't know what?" Tony asked cautiously. Peter stared at him another moment, and then he blinked, and his gaze became less intent. "Nothing." "What just happened?" "Nothing. You know I really doubt it. Come on, kid, you're worrying me." Peter's eyes fell to his injured hand, and he said, "It's kind of personal. I shouldn't even have." Tony nodded, though he was still raging with curiosity and more than a little worried. He said, "Okay. That's fine. You don't have to say anything you're not comfortable with." Peter looked up again. "No, it's not about me. I think it was mine." Tony felt a chill at the further evidence of what those stones were doing to his kid, talking to him. He wanted to know what they were saying, what it meant for Peter, and how he felt about it. "What did mine say?" he asked cautiously. Peter seemed to need to force himself to look at Tony, and his expression was almost guilty. "Nothing, I'm tired." Tony knew he was using it as an excuse, but he figured the kid probably was tired after his breakdown and with the pain of his injury, so he stood and pressed the button to lower the bed. "Get some sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." "You should go get some proper sleep, too," Peter said, "or go find Rhodey for the coffee." Tony huffed a laugh. "So, he's Rhodey already, but I had to threaten you to get to Tony." Peter smiled slightly. "It's different. He's way less scary than you." Tony frowned. "I'm scary to you?" That was the last thing he wanted to be. Peter was his son, claimed by Tony to the team, though not to Peter yet. He didn't want to be seen as scary. "Not anymore," Peter said. "But you were—" Tony brushed back his hair and stroked his forehead. "Okay, kid. I'll go track down Rhodey and the coffee. I'll come back, though. You won't be alone long." Peter's eyes became distant again, and he gave a small nod. "I know." There was something about the way he said it that Tony didn't like. It didn't sound quite like Peter. It was closer to that formal tone that had declared him worthy. He wondered if that was the stones replying and not the kid. He hoped not. Having discussions with sentient and all-powerful entities wasn't something he wanted to deal with, not when they spoke through his son. But they were right, whoever said it. Now Peter bore the stones. He would no longer be alone ever again. "Are you ready to talk to us now?" Peter cracked open his eyes, checked that Tony was gone, and then said, "Yeah, I think I am." He wanted to speak to Mind and to discover how it was he had seen and felt what he had when he'd been speaking to Tony. It had come out of nowhere, blinding him, and he was freaked out by it. They'd just been talking, when Tony's words had triggered the flood of images, thoughts, and feelings. Saving the world comes at a cost. Saving a city does, too. Ask me about the wormhole one day. And then inside the Iron Man suit with the bomb held above his head, the weight of it bearing down on him as he powered up towards the wormhole. And Mind was speaking, not in the way he usually did. Words reaching into Peter's mind, but an audible voice in the helmet. "Shall I call Miss Potts?" Peter answered, but it wasn't with his voice, it was with Tony's. "You might as well." And Peter felt it, the fear and need to connect to the woman he loved one last time, to give him the strength to follow through with this. But the call didn't connect, and Peter's heart, Tony's heart, sank. "Okay," He muttered. Let's do this. He was flying higher, gaining speed, and then he was there, through the wormhole. Peter felt the thrill of success, the triumph of being strong enough to do it, and then the suit began to freeze around him. It was not designed to handle this, it might not be enough, he might not be strong enough to do it before he died. And he was scared. He couldn't fail, but he didn't want to die, he wanted Pepper. Then the thought was banished as he saw what was above him. It was an armada of spaceships, at least 90, all of them loaded with enemies that were eager to descend to Earth and destroy everything and everyone he loved. His terror was tempered with determination. He would do this. Come on, Jarvis, he said. Get me there, sir. Malfunctioning, Mind replied, his voice crackling, but Peter knew now that it was not Mind, it was Jarvis, the original AI Tony created that became Vision. He was close enough, he had to be close enough because if not, he'd never get out again. He let the bomb go. It flew ahead of him, crashing into the ship above, and he fell back, shunning his thrusters and spinning down towards the wormhole, which was closing. He was almost out of time. And then Peter was back, staring up at Tony, who looked as scared as Peter had felt when he was in that memory, Tony's memory, and when Tony said, "You with me, kid?" He had nodded and looked up into the eyes on the bravest man he'd ever known. "Come with me," Mind said, returning Peter's attention to the present. Peter felt his eyes close, and then he was seated in a high-backed chair around a circular mahogany table with 6 other people. His surroundings were shadowy and unformed, just vague shapes. The only things that were clear were the table and the people seated around him. His eyes moved over them, his breath catching as he saw some he recognized. "You're Loki," he gasped, pointing at the person 2 seats away. "I saw you on the news." The man shook his head, dark hair brushing his shoulders, and smiled. "I am Space, Peter Parker, and it's so good to meet you." Peter looked to Space's right and saw another face he knew, though he'd not recognized the voice before. "You're Vision, aren't you?" he said. "Tony made you." "I was within Vision for a time, yes, and he came from Jarvis's form before, but I am Mind now. And I am glad we can all talk face to face." Peter's eyes darted around, seeing someone else he recognized, Peter Quill, who he was sure was not actually the man that held a gun to his head. Beside him was a small child, though she was like no child Peter had ever seen before. For starters, she was green. Next along from her was a woman with dark hair. On Peter's direct right was Doctor Strange, but Peter had a feeling he knew who he was. "Your time, right?" He nodded. "I am. It's good to meet you, Peter Parker." He gestured to Quill and said, "This is Power." Power gave him a mock salute. Soul, the small girl, gave him a small wave, and Reality. The dark-haired woman nodded at him and said, "Nice to meet you." Peter rubbed his hands over his face. "This is crazy, totally crazy. How am I even here?" "You are not technically here," Mind said. "We are within your conscious mind. We believed a face-to-face meeting would be better than to continue with the telepathic connection." "Yeah, I guess that's better. It was weird enough having one voice in my head. If you all started chatting, I think I'd go crazy for real. Not that I'm confident I'm not already. For all I know, this could all be some kind of hallucination. I am unconscious or whatever after the snap, and this is my brain tripping on chemicals. It would definitely make more sense than the other option, that I'm some kind of power source now that can." He shook his head again. "And it would definitely explain Mr. Stark. I mean, he liked me, I'm sure. He wouldn't have let me hang around otherwise, but he's so different now." "It is the connection," Soul said with her childish voice. "We thought you knew." "Yeah, soul connection, Mind told me. But even that's crazy." He looked around hopefully. "So, it's really not a hallucination?" Mind shook his head and said apologetically, "No, this is all very real." Peter sighed. "Figures that was too much to hope for. And it's okay. I mean, it's not like I don't like being alive and conscious and with Mr. Stark, but I'd really rather not have all that power." Reality spoke up, forming her words carefully. "We're sorry for the burden. But it was not a choice we made. You were worthy of us, and that sealed your fate." Peter shrugged. "It's okay, I guess. I mean, Mr. Stark, Tony, says I saved his life doing it, so that's great." "You saved the world, dude," Power corrected. "That's a whole other thing." Peter ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, it is, but it's also kinda too much to think about. I mean, I'm 16. Being Spider-Man was already big enough for me, and then the Avengers thing came up, and I thought I wanted it, and then I figured that was too big. Now I'm saving the world, and there's you and," he groaned. "It's all so big." "There's stuff we need to talk about," Power said, laying his hands down on the table and drumming his fingers. Peter held up his hand. "Yeah, but can I ask something first? What happened earlier with Tony's memory? How did I see that, and feel it?" He shuddered. "That was me," Soul said quietly. "I thought you should know when you were reaching for him and he was reaching for you, that it would help your connection to understand his burden, too." Okay, but it was also kinda a gross violation. He told me to ask him about it. He didn't offer up his memories of what he'd done and how it had felt. He wouldn't like me to know that. I don't know him that well, but I know that." Mind shook his head, eyes assessing. "I think you know him better than you think." "You do," Soul said. "You just have to be open to him." Peter spread his arms. "I'm open, wide open. I'm an empty fourth base when you're sliding in. But I still don't think I should know that stuff." He fixed his eyes on the child. "Can you not do it again?" Soul shrugged her small shoulders. "I cannot control it. If you reach for someone and they reach for you, you will see. You will need to learn control to stop it." Peter's heart sank. He didn't want to be dipping into the memories of the people he met. It was bad enough that he'd done it to Tony, who he did know, but the rest of the Avengers, if he met them, and judging what he'd seen when space had carried him along for that conversation he was going to, he didn't want to be violating their privacy. "Okay, I need to learn that," he said. "How do I learn it?" "We'll teach you," Mind said. "But it will take time. You're worthy but inexperienced." Peter snorted. "You heard the part about me being 16, right?" "We did, but it is not mortal years that matter to you now. That reality has ended." Something pierced Peter's chest like ice, and his heart struggled to cope with the horror. "Wait, mortality doesn't matter. You mean I don't die at all? What the hell? No." They all stared at him, penetrating him with their eyes, and Mind opened his mouth to answer, and then there was a crushing pain against his chest, and his eyes were flying open. The room he'd been in had vanished, the stones were gone, he was looking up into intense brown eyes under furrowed brows. Rhodey was bowed over him, his knuckles pressing. "Peter, you okay, kid?" he asked urgently. Peter nodded. "Yeah, He rubbed the sore spot on his chest. He could hear the rapid beat of his heart from the beeping monitor and the echoing thrum in his ears. "I just vagued out for a moment." Rhodey nodded. "I noticed." He placed a hand over Peter's chest and rubbed gently. "Take a few breaths." Peter obeyed, drawing them in deep and exhaling loudly, the thrumming in his ears fading as his heart slowed. "Tony's just getting something to eat," Rhodey said. "He said you were sleeping, so I figured I'd come sit with you. What happened when you vagued out? That wasn't a dream. You looked like you were awake. You scared the crap out of me." Peter shook his head and tried to keep his tone even. "I was just thinking, and then my hand was hurting." "There is something we can do about that, Mr. Parker," a voice said by the door. A pretty woman with a kind smile came in and approached the side of the bed where his injured hand lay in the plastic box. "My name is Helen Cho, and we're ready to get to work on your injury now. Are you ready?" Peter nodded eagerly. "Yeah, definitely." She smiled and asked, "Would you like to wait for Tony to join us? I understand he was in your surgery before?" "No, it's fine. I can handle it, and he needs to eat." Rhodey squeezed his shoulder and said, "If you want company, I can stick around. I've never seen tissue being recreated by a scientific miracle before. Might be interesting." "Yeah, thanks," Peter said, offering him a smile. "That'd be great." "Great," Rhodey said. "Let's get this done." Two men came in and unlocked the brakes on Peter's bed and began to wheel him out of the room, Rhodey at his side and Dr. Cho ahead of them. Peter was relieved they were about to do something about his hand, though it was not as painful as he'd told Rhodey, but he was anxious about what Mind had said. Peter needed to be able to die. Not yet, he figured another 80 years would be perfect, but the alternative of never dying was horrifying. And it wasn't like it was something he could ask until he was alone again. It was going to be a long wait.